meeting of the Security Council is resumed. I wish to remind all distinguished speakers to limit their statements to no more than 3 minutes in order to enable the Council to carry out its work expeditiously. The flashing light on the collar of the microphone will prompt speakers to bring their remarks to a close after 3 minutes. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates. You have the floor.
السيد الرئيس، يشرفني أن أتحدث اليوم نيابة عن المجموعة العربية في هذه المناقشة الهامة، وأن أتقدم بالشكر لجميع مقدمي الإحاطات على بياناتهم القيمة. السيد الرئيس، أن الالتزام بقواعد حماية المدنيين في كل حالة من حالات النزاع المسلح هو أمر غير قابل للتفاوض، ويشمل ذلك قطاع غزة الذي يتعرض فيه المدنيون الفلسطينيون لاستهداف متعمد وممنهج. لقد قتل العدوان الإسرائيلي أكثر من 35,000 فلسطيني وجرح أكثر من 78,000 آخرين، كما شرد أكثر من 75% من سكان القطاع ودمر أكثر من نصف المباني بما فيها 360,000 وحدة سكنية. إلا أن هذه الأرقام لا تصور الحجم الفعلي لهذه المأساة، فوراء كل رقم هناك أرواح سرقت وأشخاص هجروا وعائلات أبيدت ومحيت بالكامل من السجلات المدنية. لم تكن أعداد الضحايا لترتفع لهذه المستويات المفزعة لو التزمت إسرائيل بأحكام القانون الدولي الإنساني وتحملت مسؤولياتها كقوة قائمة بالاحتلال بموجب اتفاقية جنيف الرابعة، ولو استجابت إسرائيل للأوامر الصادرة عن محكمة العدل الدولية في القضية التي رفعتها جنوب أفريقيا ضدها بشأن اتفاقية منع الإبادة، بدلاً من تجاهلها الصارخ لهذه الأوامر. إن الوضع المروع في غزة اليوم هو نتيجة مباشرة للهجمات الإسرائيلية ضد المدنيين والبنية التحتية المدنية وللقيود الخانقة المفروضة على إدخال المساعدات الإنسانية والإمدادات التجارية. لقد تسبب الوضع الحالي في ارتفاع غير مسبوق في مستويات انعدام الأمن الغذائي، وعرض أكثر من نصف مليون فلسطيني للمجاعة مع استمرار إسرائيل في استخدام التجويع كسلاح حرب. وما يزيد الوضع بشاعة استهداف العاملين في المجال الإنساني ليصبح القطاع أكثر الأماكن خطورة على وجه الأرض لهؤلاء الأبطال الذين يخاطرون بحياتهم لإغاثة المحتاجين. وقد وصلت هذه الاعتداءات مرحلة خطيرة للغاية، حيث طالت قوافل المساعدات ومقرات المنظمات الإنسانية بما فيها مقر اليونروا في القدس الشرقية المحتلة. إن مثل هذه الهجمات المتكررة تشكل انتهاكاً صارخاً للقانون الدولي وتتطلب تحقيقاً فورياً وشفافاً لمحاسبة المسؤولين عنها. وتزداد الشواغل مع تصعيد إسرائيل الأخير والخطير في رفح وقيامها بإغلاق المعبر على الجانب الفلسطيني والسيطرة عليه بالقوة ودون حق، متجاهلة التزاماتها وفقا للقانون الدولي، إذ أصبح مخزون الوقود على وشك النفاذ، الأمر الذي سيتسبب في شلل حركة المساعدات الإنسانية وسيعطل بشكل شبه كامل الخدمات الأساسية في القطاع. واضطرار الأونروا تعليق عمليات توزيع المواد الغذائية في رفح بسبب شح الموارد والحالة الأمنية يوضح مدى تدهور الأوضاع. السيد الرئيس، حين اعتمد هذا المجلس في عام 1999 قراره الأول بشأن حماية المدنيين في النزاعات المسلحة، أقر بتأثير العنف على النساء والأطفال بشكل خاص، وها نحن بعد 25 عاماً على اعتماد هذا القرار نلمس هذه الحقيقة بشكل صادم في غزة، حيث يشكل الأطفال والنساء غالبية الضحايا، بل إن أعداد الأطفال الذين قتلوا في هذه الحرب يفوق إجمالي عدد الأطفال الذين قتلوا على مدى 4 أعوام في جميع النزاعات حول العالم. أما من نجا منهم فيعاني أسوأ الظروف، حيث أصبح أطفال غزة أكثر جيل تعرض لبتر الأطراف في التاريخ. وحسب اليونيسف يعاني 90% من أطفال غزة دون سن ال5 من مرض أو أكثر، فيما يعاني 16% من الأطفال دون سن الثانية من الهزال والتقزم، وهذا إلى جانب الصدمات النفسية وتأثيرها المدمر عليهم وعلى ذويهم والمجتمع بأكمله. كما تواجه النساء في غزة خاصة الحوامل والمرضعات مخاطر جسيمة في ظل غياب شبه تام لأبسط مقومات الحياة مثل الغذاء والمياه والرعاية الصحية. ولم يسلم من هذه الحرب أيضاً لا الصحفيين ولا الأطباء ولا كبار السن وذوي الإعاقة. وهنا لا بد من المطالبة بإجراء تحقيق دولي مستقل وفوري في التقارير المفزعة حول اكتشاف مقابر جماعية وتقديم الجناة إلى العدالة حتى لا يفلت أحد من العقاب. السيد الرئيس، لقد طالت الانتهاكات الإسرائيلية كافة أرجاء الأرض الفلسطينية المحتلة، ففي الضفة الغربية قتلت القوات الإسرائيلية والمستوطنين منذ أكتوبر الماضي 480 فلسطينياً، من بينهم 116 طفلاً، وتم جرح 5040 أغلبهم بالرصاص الحي، وشرد نحو 1950 فلسطيني جراء هدم المنازل وعنف المستوطنين. إن ما يحدث في غزة وبقية الأرض الفلسطينية المحتلة لا يمكن السكوت عنه أو القبول باستمراره. يجب على مجلس الأمن تحمل مسؤوليته والنظر جدياً في توفير الحماية الدولية للشعب الفلسطيني وفقاً لولايته المنصوص عليها في ميثاق الأمم المتحدة. كما تدين المجموعة العربية الاعتداءات الإسرائيلية المتكررة على الأراضي السورية وتطالب بمنع تكرارها. وبالمثل فيما يتعلق بالعدوان الإسرائيلي المستمر على القرى المدنية الآمنة في جنوب لبنان، والذي يشكل انتهاكاً للقانون الدولي بما يشمل القانون الدولي الإنساني، حيث أدى لمقتل أكثر من 80 مدنياً، من بينهم صحفيين وعمال إغاثة ونساء وأطفال ومسنين، وتدمير أطفال ومسنين، وتدمير بنية تحتية مدنية وبلدات بمعظمها، وتهجير أكثر من 93,000 لبناني، فضلاً عن قصف الجنوب اللبناني مراراً بالفسفور الأبيض المحرم دولياً. وفي سياق مخرجات الدورة العادية 33 للقمة العربية التي عقدت في مملكة البحرين يوم 16 من مايو، تطالب المجموعة العربية بما يلي: أولاً، تحقيق وقف فوري لإطلاق النار في غزة ووقف قوات الاحتلال الإسرائيلية لعملياتها العسكرية في القطاع وانسحابها منه بما يشمل معبر رفح. وتشيد المجموعة بجهود جمهورية مصر العربية ودولة قطر للتوصل لهدنة إنسانية لتخفيف المأساة في غزة ووقف التصعيد واستهداف وتهجير المدنيين وإطلاق سراح الأسرى والمحتجزين. ثانياً، ضمان إدخال المساعدات الإنسانية إلى غزة دون عوائق وفتح جميع المعابر بشكل كامل وتسهيل دخول الإمدادات التجارية للوفاء باحتياجات سكان القطاع. ثالثاً، السماح لوكالة الأونروا وسائر المنظمات الإنسانية بالعمل بحرية ودون أي تقييد لولاياتها، خاصة في ظل العوائق المستمرة من الجانب الإسرائيلي ودعم جهود المنسق الخاص سيغويد كاغ وتسهيل عملها. ورابعاً، اتخاذ تدابير فعالة للمساءلة عن الانتهاكات الجسيمة للقانون الدولي الإنساني والقانون الدولي لحقوق الإنسان، ولا سيما جرائم الحرب والجرائم ضد الإنسانية والإبادة الجماعية. وختاماً، تشدد نشدد على ضرورة إنهاء الاحتلال الإسرائيلي لكافة الأراضي الفلسطينية والعربية المحتلة بما فيها الجولان السوري، وإقامة الدولة الفلسطينية المستقلة وعاصمتها القدس الشرقية على حدود عام 1967 وفقا لقرارات الشرعية الدولية. وشكرا سيد الرئيس.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Australia.
Thank you, Mr. President, and Australia thanks Mozambique for convening today's debate, and we thank the contribution made by our briefers. We very much appreciate the Secretary-General's engagement in providing his important report on protection of civilians in armed conflict. As we mark the 25th anniversary of the protection of civilians item on the Security Council agenda, we urge all parties to conflict to comply with their obligations under international law. The safety and security of all civilians must be upheld. Colleagues, we stand on the precipice of a worsening crisis for civilians. This past year has seen widespread and harrowing human suffering. Australia remains gravely concerned for civilians in many parts of the world, including in Gaza, Sudan, and those affected by the ongoing impacts of Russia's illegal and immoral invasion of Ukraine. We recall that most victims of Hamas' abhorrent terror attacks on 7 October were civilians. The abduction of civilians and use of sexual violence is never justified. We are particularly alarmed that in 2023, civilian deaths rose by 72% from the previous year. This includes almost 30,000 civilians who were killed or injured by the use of explosive weapons across just 6 conflicts. Attacks on schools, including 408 directly hit or damaged in Gaza and more than 3,000 in Ukraine, further compound the physical and psychological burden children bear in conflict. The reprehensible destruction of critical infrastructure, including hospitals and water supply in Gaza, Sudan, and Burkina Faso, and Kahova Dam in Ukraine, increases health risks faced by civilians in conflict. This is unacceptable. We urge all states to endorse the political declaration on explosive weapons in populated areas and the Safe Schools Declaration and ensure their full implementation. We note the protection of civilians would not be possible without first responders. The death of at least 262 aid workers in Gaza alone underscores the need to ensure greater protection for humanitarian and aid workers. We commend Switzerland's leadership in drafting a resolution in this regard. We must never again witness the tragedies of Rwanda and Srebrenica that set the backdrop for Resolution 1265. For all the sobering trends in this year's report, nevertheless, there is hope. Timely action and protection mandates in peacekeeping missions have saved countless lives. We must use this anniversary to reaffirm our collective commitment to the protection of civilians. We must all do better. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Australia for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Uruguay.
Buenos días, señor presidente. Es un gusto verle presidir y agradecemos a la presidencia de Mozambique por convocar este debate abierto y permitir a los Estados no miembros del Consejo de Seguridad expresarse sobre un tema de particular relevancia como la protección de civiles y conmemorar el 25 aniversario de la resolución 1265 del Consejo de Seguridad, que estableció por primera vez la protección de civiles, POC, y el 75 aniversario de las Convenciones de Ginebra de 1949. Esta delegación se suma a las declaraciones pronunciadas por Marruecos en nombre del Grupo de Amigos de la Responsabilidad de Proteger y Noruega en nombre de Amigos de la Protección de Civiles. Señor presidente, en el contexto de los conflictos en el curso en el mundo de hoy, Uruguay enfatiza la creciente importancia de adherirse a los mandatos de protección de civiles del estricto cumplimiento del derecho internacional humanitario. El Consejo de Seguridad debe desempeñar un papel fundamental en abordar estos desafíos. Y si bien reconocemos los avances en la protección de civiles, advertimos en contra una creciente disyuntiva entre las obligaciones legales y la implementación práctica, lo que pone en peligro los avances en todas las agendas de protección y aumenta la vulnerabilidad de los civiles a crímenes atroces. Subrayamos la necesidad de que las partes en conflictos armados garanticen un entorno propicio para el trabajo humanitario, el cual debe tener acceso seguro, sin obstáculos, efectivo y sostenido a los civiles en particular, a la población especialmente vulnerable, como las mujeres, los niños, las víctimas de violencia sexual y las personas con discapacidad. Más allá de la responsabilidad del Consejo en abordar esta creciente disyuntiva, consecuencia del incumplimiento del derecho internacional humanitario, debemos reconocer nuestra responsabilidad colectiva en enfrentar también elementos que agravan y dificultan la implementación de los mandatos para la protección de civiles. Estos incluyen los desplazamientos forzados, los obstáculos en el acceso a asistencia médica, la destrucción de hospitales e infraestructura, la inseguridad alimentaria y la falta de agua potable, así como las consecuencias de las catástrofes naturales y el cambio climático. El acceso a alimentos debe estar garantizado. Se debe garantizar el ingreso a la asistencia humanitaria y favorecer los corredores. Uruguay hace un llamado a todos los Estados miembros para respaldar la declaración política sobre el fortalecimiento de la protección de civiles contra las consecuencias humanitarias de uso de armas explosivas en áreas pobladas, subrayando la necesidad de una acción colectiva para mitigar el impacto de estas armas en las poblaciones civiles. Reiteramos, señor presidente, nuestro firme compromiso de avanzar en la protección de civiles, en conflictos armados, y estamos dispuestos a participar de manera constructiva con los demás Estados miembros para abordar los desafíos multifacéticos que nos conforman este esfuerzo. Sin duda, nos queda una gran labor por hacer, pero sobre todo asumir los compromisos que hemos contraído. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Uruguay for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Brazil aligns itself with the statement delivered by Norway on behalf of the United Nations Group of Friends of the Protection of Civilians in Armed Conflict, of which we are a proud member. The Geneva Conventions were the culmination of years of development of a legal body that aimed at bringing some level of humanity to warfare after repeated dreadful experiences worldwide. The inclusion of the protection of civilians on the Council's agenda 25 years ago was a relevant step forward. It opened the path for key resolutions. These two developments are certainly causes for celebration. However, commemorations should not be empty ceremonial events. Rather, they must be acts of conscious reckoning with the lessons from history. This is why today we must be frank and direct. Instead of reaping the benefits of its own past work and, more importantly, of the development of international humanitarian law, the Council has now become a passive beholder of a complete and repeated disregard for humanitarian tenets. It has been idly watching parties to conflicts in many parts of the world seek maximum damage in total disregard for their deadly impact on civilians, the use of civilians as human shields and hostages, or direct terror inflicted on civilians as a means to weaken resistance. The last report of the Secretary General on the protection of civilians is a vivid and tragic illustration thereof. Violence against civilians happens in many, if not all, armed conflicts, and Brazil deplores each and every case equally. One civilian hurt or killed in an armed conflict anywhere is one too many. At the same time, the sheer magnitude of the ongoing violence against civilians in Gaza warrants and even demands a specific reference. We unequivocally condemned the terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas on October 7th of last year and the unacceptable taking of hostages for whose immediate release we firmly called and do so now yet again. At the same time, we cannot condone the disproportionate Israeli reaction that has led to a staggering and ever-increasing number of civilian casualties in blatant and continued violation of the principles of international humanitarian law. A permanent ceasefire is an absolute imperative to stop the carnage and spare innocent lives. Another source of grave concern in Gaza and around the world is violence against humanitarian workers, and attacks on their premises and assets. This is why Brazil, at the end of its last mandate on the Council, proposed a draft resolution on the inviolability and protection of humanitarian assistance. We thank Switzerland for following up on that initiative and hope that the Council will promptly adopt the resolution as steered by the Swiss. Brazil is also concerned with the criminalization of humanitarian assistance. Resolution 2664 was a big step forward in countering this trend, but the attempt to undermine the work of UN agencies and humanitarian NGOs is a major step backwards. The example of UNRWA comes to mind. The whole agency cannot be punished for the alleged wrongdoings of a few or some of its workers. The latter must be punished accordingly if duly proved guilty, but not the millions who depend on the agency to survive. Dismantling or weakening the agency would amount to imposing an absurd death penalty on the very victims of widespread violence. Mr. President, we are at the crossroads of a concerning disbelief in the ability to settle disputes through peaceful means. By action or complacency, we are also jeopardizing the fundaments of international humanitarian law. The international community, and this Council in particular, must act decisively to avert the tragic course of such dreadful combination that is profoundly stigmatizing our times as one of the worst in modern history. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Andorra.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Tout d'abord, je voudrais remercier les Mozambiques d'avoir organisé ce débat public commémorant le 25e anniversaire de l'adoption de la résolution 1265, ainsi qu'aux intervenants pour leurs remarques. L'Andorra adhère à la déclaration de l'Union européenne et je souhaiterais ajouter quelques points à ma capacité nationale. Monsieur le Président, comme le souligne le rapport du secrétaire général, l'Andorra est alarmée par l'érosion du droit international humanitaire et par l'augmentation du nombre de victimes civiles lors des conflits, des enfants et des femmes plus particulièrement. Et j'en cite, en 2023, 4 civils sur 10 tués sur des conflits étaient des femmes et 3 sur 10 des enfants. L'Andorra est pleinement engagée dans la protection des populations civiles et dans le respect du droit international humanitaire par l'adhésion aux principaux traités, conventions et initiatives. Nous devons honorer ces engagements pour sauver des vies et la dignité humaine. Pour renforcer la protection des populations civiles, nous accordons aussi une importance particulière à 3 aspects. Le désarmement et plus concrètement l'emploi des mines antipersonnelles avec la Convention d'Ottawa. Et bien entendu, les armes explosives dont nous avons endossé la déclaration politique de 2022 sur le renforcement de la protection des civils contre les conséquences humanitaires découlant de l'emploi de ces armes dans les zones peuplées. Les droits des enfants dans le protocole facultatif à la Convention concernant l'implication des enfants dans les conflits armés. Permettez-moi alors de saluer l'agenda du Conseil de sécurité sur la thématique sur les enfants et les conflits armés, ainsi que l'œuvre de la représentante spéciale du secrétaire général pour la sortie des enfants en temps de conflits armés dans la sensibilisation au cadre juridique et normatif du droit humanitaire international et du droit pénal international aux droits des enfants affectés par des conflits. Ces droits doivent être protégés et promus. Droit à l'éducation, dont la déclaration de Safe Schools est très importante. Donner tout l'accès à l'aide humanitaire, les droits à se livrer aux gestes indispensables et surtout d'être protégés contre la famine et l'insécurité alimentaire. L'une des méthodes de guerre condamnées par le Conseil de sécurité par la
among the methods of war which have been condemned by the Security Council in
le
Resolution 2417. And lastly, the Women, Peace and Security programs and initiatives. In this regard, as we have mentioned in previous debates, we remain very much concerned by the widespread use of sexual and gender-based violence as a tactic of war. This has been mentioned in the report and stressed by the President of the ICRC. We thank them for their their leadership. Sexual and gender-based violence is recognized as a tactic of war, which may constitute war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, thereby requiring a security-level response. The responsibility of perpetrators is recognized in Resolution 2106, which addresses the issue and recognizes the key role of the Rome Statute to bridge the gap of impunity for these heinous crimes. To conclude, no longer tolerating impunity for attacks against civilians and contributing to respect for the norms of war, as well as calling for a non-armed approach and non-violent approach to conflict, are key factors for prevention. Thank you.
The representative of Andorra for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. As we convene today to discuss the Secretary General's report on protection of civilians in armed conflict for the year 2023, for some, this topic is more than just words on a page. For some, the protection of civilians in armed conflict is a reality that they experience every day. As we speak, there are civilians who do not enjoy any protection because they are being held hostage by the vicious terror organization Hamas, which has deprived them of daylight, medical assistance and ICRC visits for 228 days now. We cannot sit at this table and discuss the protection of civilians in armed conflict without mentioning the 128 hostages who remain in Hamas captivity since the tragic events of October 7th massacre, the youngest of whom, Kfir Bibas, was less than 1 year old when he was abducted, and the oldest, Shlomo Mansour, an 86-year-old Holocaust survivor. 1,200 people were butchered on October 7th, and over 5,500 were maimed. 252 hostages were abducted, including infants, entire families, persons with disabilities, and Holocaust survivors, some of whom have since been executed, many of whom have been tortured, sexually abused, and starved in captivity. As we speak today, over 150,000 Israeli civilians have been displaced from their homes, both in the southern and on the northern border, due to the ongoing attacks by Hezbollah in the north and Hamas and its allies in the south. The horrifying acts of violence documented on October 7th only add to the trauma experienced by those displaced individuals. Today, as we have done for the past 228 days, we continue to urge this Council to do everything in its power and act for the hostages' swift release, without which the title of today's discussion, Protection of Civilians in Armed Conflict, is regretfully just an empty slogan. Mr. President, Hamas and its allies' crime continue daily and pose a grave threat to the region, as well as international peace and security, a fact that many, including in this room, continue to overlook and deny. In this vein, we must express our genuine concern regarding the dangerous link between spreading disinformation, ignorance, and the circle of violence. As we see around the world today, the disinformation pandemic has taken over the most respected institutions of our time. When ignorance meets disinformation, it disseminates extremism, which in turn leads to more violence and perpetuation of hate. We are concerned, as you all should be, that this hate, already seeping through the cracks, will end in horrifying acts of violence. So in the interest of disseminating truthful information, let us now set the record straight once again. Israel is engaged in a defensive struggle against Hamas. Hamas, who is known for its disregard for civilian lives. Hamas, who routinely employs despicable tactics and hides behind its population. Hamas, who uses Palestinian children as human shields. Hamas, who commandeers hospitals, turning them into terror hubs and their own headquarters. Hamas, who abducted innocent Israeli civilians from their homes and now surround itself with our people to conceal its operations. Hamas, who bombs time and again humanitarian crossings and steals the delivery of aid from its own people. Hamas, who despite numerous and extremely generous ceasefire offers, persistently refuses to lay down its arms and continues to perpetuate heinous crimes against Israeli civilians and its own Palestinian population. Mr. President, Israel does everything in its power to act in accordance with the principles of proportionality, distinction, and precaution, and we pay a heavy price for our commitment. We're often required to put our own forces at risk in order to preserve civilian life. Years of conflict have sharpened our expertise in urban warfare, developing complex strategies for minimizing civilian casualties, more than any other army in the world. However, Israel is fighting a vicious enemy. While we are trying to minimize casualties, Hamas tries to maximize them. While we adhere to the rules of international humanitarian law, Hamas blatantly defies them, openly fires from civilian population centers, making a mockery of our established international legal system. While we try to evacuate Palestinian civilians to keep them from harm, exercising robust precautionary measures, Hamas threatens its own civilians to stay in danger or hides within the evacuating crowds to shield themselves from harm. The difference between us has never been more palpable. We lament every civilian casualty in our region, but we have not heard a single condemnation from any Palestinian official of the October 7th attack or any of the terror attacks that followed that atrocious day. Hamas does not care about civilian lives. They have made it perfectly clear. They pride themselves on their disregard for human life and their cruelty towards civilians. But the Palestinian Authority, judging by their unfortunate choices, do not care about their own civilians either. The Palestinian Authority is trying to run with the hare and hunt with the hounds. They will not condemn Hamas, yet gladly repeat its propaganda. They will not express concern for the hostages, demand their release, and do all in their power to ensure the hostages receive humanitarian assistance, yet cry out to the world to send humanitarian aid to their own civilians. They shoulder none of the responsibility and accept no accountability. Mr. President, protecting Israeli civilians as a democratic, law-abiding state can be very challenging. Repeatedly, we find ourselves attacked by forces that have no respect for international legal norms and in fact actively try to disrupt the rule-based order. Colleagues, Israel will not succumb to terror and we will not give up on our values. We will continue defending civilians in our region, both Israeli and Palestinian. We will continue providing humanitarian aid to all those in need. We will continue to distinguish between civilians and combatants and take all necessary precautions as mandated by IHL and far beyond the letter of the law. We will continue fighting against terror. We extend a hand in peace to all our partners to work with us towards a more peaceful and safer Middle East for every civilian, man, woman, and child. Join us in this endeavor. Do not stand idly by. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Israel for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Vietnam.
Mr. President, Vietnam wishes to thank Mozambique for convening this important meeting. Armed conflicts and hostilities nowadays continue to threaten the lives and jeopardize the livelihood of millions of civilians in different parts of the world. Take Gaza as an example, where more than 150 civilians lost their lives every day, on average, over the past 7 months. This reality stresses the need for more concrete actions from member states and the Security Council to better protect civilians in conflicts. In this connection, we call on all parties to the ongoing conflicts to strictly abide by international law, especially the 4 Geneva Conventions of 1949, as well as other relevant instruments of international humanitarian law and UN resolutions. Within the UN framework, the Security Council and other main organs must remain actively seized of the humanitarian situations in conflict areas and take necessary actions in a timely manner, including compulsory measures under Chapter 7 of the Charter, when necessary, to bring an end to casualties and harm caused to the civilian population and infrastructure. In addition, the UN peacekeeping missions play a crucial role in monitoring the implementation and compliance with international humanitarian standards by parties to conflicts on the ground, and thus contribute to the mitigation of the impacts on civilians, especially women and children. Mr. President, from its own experience, Vietnam deeply understands the impacts and long-term consequences of wars and conflicts on the lives and well-being of the civilian population. We are of the view that the best way to protect civilians at all times is to address the root causes of conflicts, as well as create conducive conditions for dialogue and reconciliation to prevent any occurrence or recurrence of armed confrontations. On its part, Vietnam has made continuing efforts to promote the protection of civilians in conflicts. In terms of national legislation, Vietnam has criminalized serious crimes in its penal code, such as aggression, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes of undermining peace. At the Security Council, during its presidency in April 2021, Vietnam spearheaded the adoption of Resolution 2573 on safeguarding critical civilian infrastructure in conflicts. We also authored a presidential statement on mine action and presided over an open debate on conflict-related sexual violence and an area formula meeting on parental care for unattended children during conflicts. And by continuing to actively participate in UN peacekeeping operations, Vietnam has effectively contributed to the protection of civilians on the ground. Mr. President, Vietnam remains committed to further promoting the protection of civilians in armed conflicts and stands ready to work with fellow member states and relevant organizations in this common endeavor, including through the effective implementation of this Council's relevant resolutions. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Vietnam for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Colombia.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, President.
Colombia defiende firmemente
Colombia
la centralidad del
robustly defends
multilateralismo,
the importance of
así como la del derecho
multilateralism
internacional
and of
humanitario
international
para
humanitarian
atender
law
los complejos
in addressing
desafíos
the
que presentan
complex
los conflictos
challenges
armados internacionales
thrown
y
up
no
by international
internacionales.
and non-international
El
armed
aumento de la
conflicts.
conflictividad y la
The
violencia en el
increase in
mundo es
conflict and
alarmante
violence
y
across
ha
the world is
generado
alarming and
consecuencias
has had
deplorables para
appalling
la población
consequences
civil,
for the civilian
afectando de
population,
manera
disproportionately
desproporcionada a
affecting
mujeres,
women,
niñas y niños,
children,
persons
with disability,
discapacidad, pueblos
indigenous
indígenas,
peoples,
afrodescendientes y
Afro-descendants,
comunidades
and
campesinas.
rural communities.
Por ello, más que
It
nunca,
is
es
therefore
oportuno
more timely
conmemorar
than
el
ever
aniversario
to
de
commemorate the
los
25th
25 años de la
anniversary of the
adopción de la
adoption of Resolution 1265 of 1999
y
and
reafirmar
to
nuestro
reaffirm
compromiso
our collective
colectivo con la
commitment
prevención de los
to
conflictos
preventing
y la búsqueda de
conflicts
la paz.
and seeking peace.
En ese sentido,
In this
instamos a los
regard, we
Estados
urge member
miembros a
states
cumplir las
to
disposiciones de
implement
esta
the provisions of this resolution,
particularmente en
particularly
materia de
when it
protección de
comes to the
civiles
protection of
y de
civilians
acceso
and
sin
ensuring
restricciones
unhindered
y en
and
condiciones de
safe
seguridad
access
del
for
personal
humanitarian
humanitario a la
personnel
población
to
civil en
civilians in
situaciones de
situations of
conflicto
armed
armado.
conflict.
A su vez, las
In
estrategias
turn, the
destinadas a la
strategies
prevención,
for prevention,
protección y
protection,
atención
and care
deben considerar las
must
particularidades
take into account
culturales,
cultural,
étnicas,
ethnic,
económicas,
economic,
políticas,
political,
jurídicas,
legal,
sociales y
social,
geográficas
and
de los
geographic
civiles
specificities
para
of
promover
civilians
acciones
in order to
contextualizadas.
promote actions which are specific
Consciente
to
de los
context.
retos existentes
We're
en
aware of
relación con la
the
situación
challenges
humanitaria de nuestro
with
país.
regard to the humanitarian
Colombia ha
situation in our
priorizado la
country. So Colombia
implementación de
has
los acuerdos
prioritized the
de paz de
implementation of the 2016
2016
peace
y la
agreements in our
implementación de
country and the
programas y
implementation
proyectos
of
que
programs
permiten
and
construir una
projects
cultura de
which
paz
will allow us
desde
to
los
build a
distintos
culture of peace
territorios de la geografía
throughout our
nacional.
national territory.
Entre las afectaciones
There
a la
are
población
numerous
civil que
threats to
persisten y
civilians which
frente a
are
las que aún
persistent
debemos
and which we
redoblar
must
nuestros
redouble our efforts
esfuerzos,
to tackle,
se incluyen las
including
amenazas con
threats
artefactos
of
explosivos,
explosive
el
devices,
aumento del
the
hacinamiento
increase
en
of
centros de
overcrowding
detención
in detention
transitoria,
and
la
transit
degradación
centres,
ambiental, la
environmental
inseguridad
deterioration,
alimentaria y la
food
presencia de
insecurity,
actores armados
and the presence of
en los
armed
territorios
actors in
rurales.
rural areas.
Mientras estas sigan existiendo, es nuestro deber
While all of these
brindar
still
protección
exist, it is our
suficiente y
duty to
significativa
provide
a los
sufficient and
civiles
significant
para
protection to
reducir el
civilians
costo humano,
so as to reduce the human,
económico, social y
economic,
ambiental
social and
de la
environmental
violencia
costs
y
of
facilitar
violence
la
and
construcción de
to
una paz
facilitate
sostenible.
the construction
Con
of a
miras a
sustainable
reforzar las
peace.
garantías brindadas por el
In
Estado
order to
colombiano,
bolster
el
the
gobierno de
guarantees
Gustavo
provided by the
Petro
Colombian state,
avanza
the
en la
government of
creación de la
Gustavo
Comisión
Petro is
Nacional para
creating
la
a
Aplicación
national
del
commission
Derecho
to implement
Internacional
international
Humanitario,
humanitarian
un
law.
órgano consultor y de apoyo a las
This is an
entidades y
advisory
instancias
and support
responsables
body
de la
to
aplicación
the
de las
entities and
medidas y
instances which are
estrategias
responsible for
nacionales.
implementing our national measures
Colombia
and
se
strategies.
adhirió también a la
Colombia has also
Declaración sobre
acceded
Escuelas
to the
Seguras
Safe Schools
y ha
Declaration and
establecido una
established
relación de
a
cooperación
cooperation
entre el
relationship
Comité
between
Internacional de la
the
Cruz Roja
International
y
Committee of the
diferentes
Red Cross
entidades
and various
estatales con el
state
objetivo de avanzar
instances
en la
to
implementación
further
de
the
nuestro plan de
implementation
acción
of our
nacional.
national action plan.
Señor Presidente,
President,
es fundamental la
the
incorporación
systematic
sistemática
incorporation
de
of
consideraciones
considerations
relativas al derecho
regarding
internacional
international humanitarian law
en
is
todos los
fundamental at
niveles
all levels,
para poder responder
so as to respond
efectivamente a las
effectively to the
necesidades de la
needs of
población
the civilian
civil.
population.
Por ello, hacemos un
We
llamado a
therefore
renovar el
call
compromiso
for a
de
renewed
todos los
commitment
estados
from all
con los
states to
convenios de
the
Ginebra
1949
de
Geneva Conventions
1949 y
and
sus
their
protocolos
additional
adicionales
protocols,
como los dispuestos en la
as well as
resolución
to the provisions of Resolution
1265 de
1265 of
1999.
1999.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Colombia for their statement. I now give the floor to the permanent observer of the Holy See to the United Nations.
Thank you, Mr. President. As we mark the 25th anniversary of Resolution 1265 and the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions, it is clear that the need to strengthen the protection of civilians in armed conflict is more urgent than ever. The increase in conflicts around the world in the recent years is alarming. These conflicts generate catastrophic effects on the lives of millions of people, with civilians bearing the brunt of the impact. Indeed, it appears that the distinction between military and civil targets is no longer respected. There is no conflict that does not end up in some way indiscriminately striking the civilian population. The majority of those affected by the scourge of war are compelled to flee from their countries of origin, while a significant number of others have been victims of such conflicts. It is imperative that the civilian victims are not seen as collateral damage, but as men and women with names and surnames. In light of these grave circumstances, the Holy See urges the implementation of Resolution 1265 in the protection of those who face greater risks during conflict, such as humanitarian personnel, healthcare workers, religious personnel, journalists, displaced persons, women, children, and persons with disabilities. While emphasizing the need for properly implementing these provisions and incorporating them into all peacekeeping mandates, my delegation would like to present 3 key points for the Council's considerations. First, it is important to recognize that modern war no longer takes place solely on the battlefield. It is also adversely affects civilian infrastructure, such as schools, hospitals, and places of worship. These safe havens can become devastating targets, disproportionately affecting the lives of the innocent and defenseless. In this regard, my delegation urges the particular protection of places of worship in conflict zones. These sites are not merely places of prayer. They also serve as places of assistance and protection for those in need. Second, the cessation of production, stockpiling, and use of indiscriminate weapons such as landmines, cluster munition, and explosive weapons in populated areas is a crucial measure towards ensuring the protection of civilians in armed conflicts. The consequences of these instruments of death are well known, which, along with other explosive remnants of war, continue to pose a serious threat to civilians even after hostilities have ended. In this regard, my delegation commends the United Nations Mine Action Service for its valuable work and calls for the implementation of the political declaration on the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Third, the blockade of humanitarian aid in conflict zones and the increased attacks on humanitarian personnel are of great concern. The Holy See, while asking that international humanitarian law be strictly observed, condemns any attempt to obstruct the delivery of supplies like food, water, and medicine to those suffering from the impacts of war, as well as the incriminating attacks on humanitarian and medical personnel who put their lives in danger to help the population on the ground. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the permanent observer of the Holy See for their statement. Thank you. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation is grateful to Mozambique and Switzerland for convening this important debate. The topic is of great importance to Ukraine, as Ukrainian civilian population is hardly attacked by the Russian Federation daily. We appreciate Secretary General's comprehensive report outlining dire situation on the forefront of the protection of civilians around the globe, and particularly in my country. Civilians and their rights are among the first to be hit by any war. It is the case for Ukrainians, whom Russian Federation has made target of its war of aggression. It is the case for people in other countries suffering from conflicts, including in the Middle East and Africa. This year marks the 25th anniversary of the Security Council's consideration of the protection of civilians as an item on its agenda, and marks the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions of 1949. It is almost a quarter century ago that the Security Council, in its first thematic resolution 1265, underlined the need to put an end to deliberate targeting of civilians and emphasized the responsibility of states to end impunity and to prosecute those responsible for genocide, crimes against humanity, and serious violations of international humanitarian law. A year later, in 2000, Ukraine, as the then-elected Council's member, voted for another thematic resolution, 1296. By adopting this document, the Council reaffirmed its readiness to consider situations of deliberate targeting of civilian populations and other violations in situations of armed conflict, and to adopt appropriate steps. After so many years, we continue to see a grim increase in civilian casualties due to conflicts. Council's capacity to take efficient actions remains a goal rather than a reality. Mr. President, Russian Federation continues its war of terror against Ukrainian people, targeting critical civilian infrastructure, including hospitals and schools, and residential areas with wide range of conventional arms, including missiles, aerial bombs, and combat UAVs. This relentless onslaught has resulted in significant casualties and widespread destruction. Despite global condemnation and numerous appeals from Ukraine and the international community, Russian Federation persists in committing crimes of deportation and forced displacement of Ukrainian children. Global support is crucial. We call on increased consolidated international pressure on Russia to stop its IHL violations, return all Ukrainian deportees, including children, prisoners of war, and civilian detainees. It is one of the key priorities of the peace formula and would be one of the key topics of the upcoming peace summit in Switzerland in June. Accountability and damage compensation for these crimes is what a just peace entails. Ukraine has developed a unique concept for an international compensation mechanism to address the damages to civilian population caused by Russian aggression. We will spare no efforts in supporting establishment of such mechanism that will serve as a deterrent against future acts of aggression towards sovereign states. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Malaysia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Malaysia thanks Mozambique for convening this important debate. Our gratitude also goes to the briefers for their valuable insights. Malaysia condemns violent attacks on civilians during armed conflicts. Regrettably, in many parts of the world, for example in Palestine and Myanmar, innocent civilians, including women and children, media personnel, and humanitarian workers continue to bear the brunt of war. The 2024 report by the UN Secretary General on the protection of civilians paints a distressing picture that armed conflicts continue to cause great sufferings among civilians, marked by unacceptable levels of death, destruction to civilian infrastructure, conflict-induced hunger, and forced displacement. Mr. President, here my delegation wishes to make the following points. First, Malaysia advocates peaceful settlement of disputes in line with the UN Charter. Ending armed conflict is the most effective way to protect civilians. Thus, there must be real efforts to end ongoing armed conflicts through durable and permanent ceasefires to give way to dialogue and peaceful resolution. Ceasefires and end of hostilities in general is also crucial to enable humanitarian assistance to be delivered more effectively to affected civilians. Second, the virulence of conflict is partly caused by a culture of impunity. Genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes of aggression are among the most serious crimes under international law. Perpetrators of such crimes must be held accountable and brought to justice, the important role of accountability mechanisms, including the International Criminal Court and international tribunals set up by the UN, cannot be overstated. There must not be selectivity nor double standard in the application of accountability processes. Selectivity and double standard will only undermine the legitimacy and trust in the processes and also international law more broadly. Third, the responsibility and obligations of member states to protect civilians in armed conflict are clearly stipulated in international humanitarian law and relevant Security Council resolutions. We must remember that there are laws even in war, although war must be avoided by all means. Protection of civilians is central to the rules of war as stipulated in the Geneva Conventions. Compliance with these laws is not optional, it is a moral and legal obligation. Finally, Malaysia considers the United Nations peacekeeping operations, UNPKO, as an indispensable instrument in the protection of civilians in armed conflicts. Malaysia is one of the long-standing contributors of the UNPKO, and there are currently 865 personnel of the Malaysian Armed Forces and Royal Malaysia Police in 5 UN peacekeeping operations. Mr. President, with so many armed conflicts still raging around the world, our discussion today is extremely vital and relevant. While we continue striving towards ending these armed conflicts, we must also do more to uphold international humanitarian law and implement relevant UN resolutions to ensure the protection of civilians. Malaysia will continue to do its part in contributing constructively in this endeavor. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malaysia for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the observer state of Palestine.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Les conventions de Genève ont été adoptées il y a 75 ans pour protéger les personnes ne prenant pas part aux hostilités, au premier rang desquelles les civils. Ils ont été adoptés en réponse à la Seconde Guerre mondiale qui avait frappé de plein fouet les civils en l'absence de lignes de front identifiables. Et donc, la priorité fut de restaurer le principe d'humanité et de distinction pour restaurer la protection des civils, désormais exposés plus que jamais aux horreurs de la guerre. Depuis, l'humanité n'a cessé de réaffirmer et renforcer ses règles fondamentales, y compris le Conseil de sécurité qui, il y a 25 ans, a pris l'engagement de promouvoir la protection des civils et qui adopta des résolutions concernant les civils et les catégories dont la protection était particulièrement importante, y compris les enfants, les femmes, le personnel humanitaire et les journalistes. Or, c'est précisément cette population protégée qui est prise pour cible par Israël à Gaza. Gaza a vu le plus grand nombre d'enfants tués, de personnel onusien tué, de personnel humanitaire national et international tué, et de journalistes tués. C'est l'an zéro du droit international à Gaza. L'an zéro du droit international à Gaza. Comme si aucune règle n'avait été élaborée. Mais les règles existent et leur violation flagrante doit être sanctionnée. C'est l'impunité qui a laissé notre peuple dépourvu face à une machine de guerre impitoyable qui voit en chacun d'eux, dès avant leur naissance et même après leur mort, des ennemis. Ce n'est pas une formule, mais une réalité. Savez-vous combien de femmes enceintes ont été tuées avec leur enfant encore à naître? Savez-vous qu'Israël détient les corps de Palestiniens qu'elle a tués, parfois pour des décennies, refusant de les rendre à leurs familles pour qu'ils puissent enfin les enterrer? Monsieur le Président, jamais une population civile n'a été ainsi prise pour cible dans un territoire exempt, assiégé, bombardé, affamé. Elle se déplace dans une cage, essayant d'éviter la mort avec nulle part où aller, déplacée de force d'une mort à l'autre,
and one way
Près
or another,
d'1 million
death
de Palestiniens
finds them.
ont été
Nearly 1 million
déplacés de force
Palestinians
au
have
cours des
been
2 dernières
forcibly
semaines,
displaced over the past
essayant encore une
2
fois
weeks.
d'esquiver
Once again,
les bombardements
they were
israéliens.
unable to
Jamais l'infrastructure civile d'un
escape
pays n'a
Israeli
été
bombardment.
ainsi
Never
méthodiquement
has a
détruite.
civilian population been so methodically
Les hôpitaux,
annihilated.
les
Hospitals,
universités,
universities,
les institutions
schools,
internationales,
international
les lieux où les
institutions,
populations civiles avaient
areas
trouvé
where
refuge, y
civilians
compris
sought refuge,
des bâtiments de l'ONU.
including United Nations
Les
premises.
parents sont dépourvus et impuissants pour
Parents have
protéger leurs
been
enfants
powerless in
abandonnés par
protecting
le
their
droit
children who have been
et ceux qui ont
abandoned by the
l'obligation de le
law
défendre.
and abandoned by those who have an obligation to
Les scènes
defend
que nous voyons
them.
à Gaza,
The
il est très
scenes we have
difficile
seen in
de
Gaza
pouvoir
make it so
véritablement
difficult
les
to
décrire.
describe.
Des Palestiniens ont été sommairement
Palestinians
exécutés
have been summarily
après avoir été
executed
détenus,
after having
alors
been
qu'ils étaient ligotés,
detained,
qu'ils
while
avaient les
their
yeux bandés.
hands were
Des fosses
tied,
communes
their
ont
legs
été
were tied, their
découvertes,
eyes
qui
were
révèlent
covered,
l'ampleur
their
et
mass
l'horreur des crimes.
graves which
Les prisonniers palestiniens, y
expose
compris
the
les milliers
magnitude
arrêtés
of
au
the
cours
horror
des
of the
6 derniers
crimes
mois,
over the
sont
past 6
torturés,
months.
ce qui a
Palestinians have
mené à
been
des amputations
tortured,
et des
resulting
morts
in
en détention.
amputations, resulting in deaths
À Gaza,
in
toute une
detention.
population
In
est
Gaza,
assiégée,
an entire
bombardée,
population is
affamée.
besieged,
Et
bombarded,
la famine n'est
and
pas le
subject to
résultat non voulu
starvation.
de la guerre,
This is not an
mais une
unintended
arme
consequence of war.
supplémentaire
This is
déployée
an
par Israël
additional
contre le
weapon
peuple palestinien.
wielded by Israel
Une
against the
population
Palestinian
meurt
people.
alors que l'aide
People
humanitaire est à
are
quelques
dying at a
mètres
time
d'elle.
when humanitarian assistance
Est-ce
is just a
qu'Israël
few
ne bloque
meters
pas?
from them.
Elle
Israel
laisse ses
has
colons
been
et ses
blocking this
extrémistes
assistance. Its convoys
attaquer
and
et
extremists
détruire.
are allowed to attack, to
Est-ce que
destroy.
quelqu'un ici ne pense pas que les
And
parents palestiniens
do
souffrent
people really not
quand ils
believe that
perdent leurs
Palestinian
enfants?
parents don't
Est-ce que
suffer
quelqu'un
when they
ici
lose their children? Does
qui a
anybody
des
in this
enfants,
chamber with
qui
children,
connaît
who
des
has
enfants,
children,
peut
who
imaginer
knows
ce
children?
que c'est
Can
le sort
anybody
de
even
ces orphelins,
imagine the plight of these
de ces
children, the plight of those
ces
who
enfants
have
traumatisés
had limbs amputated,
à vie?
these children who have been traumatized
En
for
Cisjordanie,
life?
les
In
attaques
the
de
West
colons et
Bank,
des forces
attacks
d'occupation
by
israéliennes sont
settlers and
incessantes
Israeli occupation forces
et elles ont
are
fait plus de 500 morts et
incessant,
des milliers de
more than
blessés au
500,000
cours des 6 derniers
dead,
mois,
thousands
y
wounded
compris
over the
hier à
past 6
Jenin,
months, including yesterday in Jenin,
où un chirurgien,
where a surgeon,
professeur
a
et des
professor,
étudiants ont été tués.
and students were killed.
Au lieu d'être tenu pour
Instead
responsable,
of being
Israël,
held
confiante en
accountable,
l'impunité dont
Israel,
elle a joui jusqu'à
confident in the
aujourd'hui,
impunity which it has
accuse
enjoyed up
et
until
incite.
today, accuses
Elle accuse et
and
incite
incites,
contre l'ONU.
accuses and incites.
On l'a vu encore
These
aujourd'hui dans le discours
accusations
du
and incitement
représentant
is
israélien.
are directed
Contre
against the
les
United
agences
Nations. We heard this from
humanitaires, notamment
the
l'UNRWA.
Israeli representative today.
Contre les ONG.
Against
Contre
humanitarian
les États qui
bodies,
osent
including
dénoncer ces
UNRWA,
crimes.
NGOs. This is a rhetoric is
Elle
targeted against
accuse
those who dare
d'antisémitisme, de complicité avec le
condemn
terrorisme
those crimes. They are
et le
accused of
nazisme,
anti-Semitism,
tous, y compris ses plus proches alliés.
Nazism, including its
Sans aucune
closest
honte.
allies, without
Et cette
any
incitation a des conséquences
shame.
pratiques sur
And
le terrain.
these instances of
C'est
incitement
elle qui
has
autorise les
practical
soldats israéliens
consequences
à tuer le
on the ground.
personnel onusien
This
et humanitaire.
authorizes Israel
C'est elle qui
to
autorise les colons
kill
à
humanitarian
saborder l'aide
personnel,
humanitaire
and settlers
et à
are
attaquer
able to
l'UNRWA.
hoard humanitarian assistance, to
Ce
attack
Conseil
UNRWA.
a une
The
responsabilité
Security
de
Council
faire vivre ces
shoulders a
résolutions sur le terrain
responsibility to
en
ensure the
Palestine.
enforcement of the resolutions on the ground in
Israël ne vous laisse
Palestine,
qu'un choix.
of the resolutions on the ground in
Israël ne vous laisse
Palestine.
qu'un choix qui s'avérera
Israel
décisif
leaves
pour
you
l'avenir du
with
droit
no
international.
choice, which would be decisive for the future
Sacrifier
of
les
international
règles et
humanitarian
les
law.
mécanismes mis en place
Sacrificing
pour défendre
rules
les
and
populations
mechanisms
civiles
established for the
et le
defense of
droit
civilians
international
and international law
afin
in order
protéger l'impunité
to
d'Israël
protect the impunity
ou mettre fin à
of
cette
Israel.
impunité
Or, on the
pour
other hand,
défendre
to
ces
end
règles
this impunity,
et ces
to
mécanismes.
uphold the
Le
rules,
choix
to
semble
uphold the
évident,
mechanisms. The
mais
choice
certains
appears to be
États
clear,
tergiversent.
but some states
Ils
are
sont
dithering.
minoritaires
They
et je
are in the
voudrais les
minority,
mentionner
and I
aujourd'hui.
wish to mention these
Nous les
states
appelons
today. We
à se
call
réveiller avant
upon
qu'il ne
them
soit
to
trop tard,
awaken
afin que
before
la
it is too
honte
late,
ne les poursuive
so
pas
that
à tout jamais
shame
pour les
will
choix qu'ils font
not tarnish
et pour
them
leur complicité, que
forevermore,
ce soit
and
par
for the
leurs actions ou
complicity,
leur inaction
for their action
face
or their
au génocide en
inaction
cours à Gaza.
in the face of a
Un
genocide
État
in
au-dessus
Gaza,
des lois se
not
comportera
to
toujours comme un État
follow
hors la
them
loi. Et
forevermore.
c'est ce que nous voyons
this is a state which is acting in a lawless way. This is what we see, and the Palestinian people are paying the price.
Le seul moyen de vraiment
The
protéger
only
les
way to
civils,
truly protect
c'est de vouloir
civilians
protéger tous les civils,
is to seek to protect
sans
all
distinction
civilians,
sur la base de leur
without
origine,
distinction on the basis
sur leur
of their
appartenance
origin,
religieuse,
their
sur leur
religious
appartenance raciale.
affiliation,
Et
their
l'engagement de
racial
l'État de la
affiliation,
Palestine
and the
en la
commitment of the
matière est
state of
total.
Palestine to that
Nous n'avons
end
jamais
is
justifié le
entire.
fait de tuer
We
des
have never
civils.
justified the killing of
Mais
civilians.
Israël a l'outrance
However,
sélective.
Israel has a
Ces
selective
civils,
approach.
quand ils
Its
sont tués,
civilians,
il
when
faut que le
they
monde
are
entier
killed,
se
the
soulève et
whole
rejette cela.
world
Ces
needs
civils,
to
quand ils sont
mourn
en
them.
captivité,
Their
il faut que le
civilians, when
monde
they are in
entier se
captivity,
mobilise
the
pour les
whole
libérer.
world needs to mobilize to
Mais elle
release
n'hésite
them.
pas à
But
justifier le
Israel does
meurtre
not
des civils
hesitate to
palestiniens
justify
par
the
dizaines de
deaths
milliers,
of
plus de 35 000 à
Palestinian
Gaza. Le fait
civilians,
d'avoir
more than
blessé plus
35,000
de
in Gaza,
80 000
more
Palestiniens à
than
Gaza, le fait d'avoir
80,000
déplacé plus de
Gazans
2
in
millions de
Gaza have
Palestiniens
been
à Gaza,
more than 2 million
et le fait de
Palestinians have been
détenir
displaced in
dans ces
Gaza.
prisons
They
et ces
have
cages
detained in
9
prisons,
000
in cages,
prisonniers palestiniens, y
9,000
compris des enfants en
Palestinians,
bas âge.
including
1 million
children,
de Palestiniens
small
ont été
children.
détenus
1
par
million
Israël à un
Palestinians have
moment ou
been
à un autre,
detained by
depuis la
Israel at a
Nakba
time or
jusqu'à
another
aujourd'hui.
since from the Nakba
1
to
million
the
de
present day.
Palestiniens.
1 million
Certains ont peur
Palestinians.
d'employer certains mots
Some
quand il
are
s'agit
afraid
d'Israël.
of using certain
Mais ce qu'il faut
words
craindre, ce
when
n'est
it
pas
comes
les
to
mots,
Israel.
mais les
But what
politiques
we
qu'elles
must fear are
décrivent
not words, but the
et dont notre
policies which they
peuple souffre dans
describe.
sa chair.
Our people are
Et
suffering
permettez-moi
as a
de dire à la
consequence. And I
conseillère
wish to take the
spéciale du
opportunity to
secrétaire
tell the
général
Special
pour la
Advisor of the
prévention
Secretary
du
General
génocide
for the prevention of
qu'elle se serait
genocide
honorée
that
à mentionner Gaza
it would be
aujourd'hui,
honorable
qu'elle ne
to
remplit pas son
mention
mandat
Gaza today,
en décidant
that
de ne
there's a
rien
failure to
dire
comply with the
sur
mandate
les
by
horreurs que
deciding
notre
to
peuple vit à Gaza,
say nothing about
qu'elle se
the
décide à ne
plight
rien
of
dire alors que la
Palestinians
Cour
in Gaza,
internationale
to
de
decide to
justice
say
est en train
nothing when the International
d'examiner
Court of Justice is
l'accusation de
currently
génocide contre
examining
Israël,
the accusation
alors que
of
le monde entier
genocide
est en train de
against
voir
Israel.
Israël priver notre
The
population
world is seeing
des
Israel
conditions les plus
deprive
élémentaires
our
de
people
vie
of the most
et
basic
détruire
necessities of life.
méthodiquement
Israel
toutes
is
les conditions
methodically destroying
indispensables
all
à la
of
vie
the
à Gaza.
basic
Pas un
indispensable
mot
conditions for
sur
life.
Gaza.
Not a
Pour
word
parler
is
de
mentioned
prévention
on
de
Gaza.
génocide. Pas un
Talking
mot
about
alors que le
prevention of genocide.
génocide
Not
est en
a
cours
word when
à
the
Gaza.
genocide is currently
Permettez-moi de
underway
conclure
in Gaza. I wish to
en
conclude
évoquant un événement historique
by
important
referring to a
qui est une des raisons
historic
derrière
event
toute l'élaboration
which,
du droit tel que nous le connaissons,
which
qui est l'Holocauste.
encapsulates the
Israël
law
évoque
and
l'Holocauste
the Holocaust.
pour se
Israel
protéger
talks
contre
about
les
the
accusations
Holocaust to
concernant
protect
ces crimes.
itself against
Elle utilise la mémoire de
accusations of
6
its
millions de
crimes.
victimes
The memory of 6 million victims
pour
is
justifier
used
les
to
crimes
justify
que nous avons
the
dénoncés
crimes which
ensemble comme
we
humanité,
denounce
notamment
together
après l'horreur
as
de
humanity.
l'Holocauste.
Specifically
Nous honorons
after
la
the
mémoire
horror
des
of the
victimes de
Holocaust,
l'Holocauste
we honor the
et
memory
de
of the
toutes les
victims of the
victimes des crimes de
Holocaust
guerre,
and
des
all the
crimes contre
victims of
l'humanité et de
war
génocide
crimes,
à
crimes
travers
against
l'histoire et à
humanity,
travers le monde,
genocide throughout history,
en nous
throughout the
souvenant toujours
world.
qu'il n'y
We
a pas des
will
populations
always bear in
civiles
mind
plus
that
civiles
there
que d'autres.
are no civilians
Nos
who are
civils
more
sont des
civilians in
civils.
nature than others.
Les
Our
Palestiniens sont
civilians
des
are
êtres humains.
civilians.
Ceux qui
Palestinians
ne
are
veulent pas
human
reconnaître
beings.
notre humanité,
Those who do
ceux
not
qui
wish
nient
to
notre
recognize our
existence,
humanity,
ceux
those
qui
who
nient
deny
notre
our
appartenance
existence,
à la
those
famille
who
des
deny
nations.
our
Ceux-là
affiliation with
doivent
the
être
family of
sanctionnés
nations. They
et
need to be
jamais,
sanctioned.
jamais
They need to be
autorisés
punished.
à
And never
accuser
can
au
they
lieu
be
d'être
authorized
accusés.
to
Nous
level
nous tenons
accusations
ensemble
instead
et à vos
of being
côtés
subject to
pour défendre
accusations.
ces
We stand
principes
in
et cette
solidarity
humanité.
to uphold these principles and that humanity.
I thank the representative of the observers state of Palestine for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Djibouti.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, Djibouti expresses its gratitude to Mozambique for convening this annual open debate of the Security Council on a matter of vital importance, and thanks the Secretary General for the annual report on the protection of civilians in armed conflict. The report gives an opportunity to assess the state of protection of civilians in the world, and the findings continue to underscore two major facts. There are far too many conflicts in the world, some protracted with a duration of more than 30 years, and the shocking toll of armed conflicts of civilians in many conflict zones in the world. Over the course of 25 years since the adoption of Security Council Resolution 1265 in 1999, we have collectively invested in enhancing the protection agenda, strengthening its architecture, establishing monitoring and accountability mechanisms, and through substantive policy discussions, we continuously developed a shared understanding of what protection mandates entail for UN peace operations. We welcome the fact that the protection of civilians agenda is prioritized in Resolution 2719 in the planning as well as the concept of operations and rules of engagement of African Union-led peace support operations. Djibouti, as one of the highest per capita contributors of uniformed personnel to UN peacekeeping support mandates, anchored on protecting international humanitarian law when mitigating armed conflicts. African peacekeepers are increasingly faced with situations where they have to confront radicalized violent groups and non-state actors with hostile intentions and who deliberately target non-combatants. In light of the changing nature of conflicts, in particular on the continent of Africa, we underscore the importance of ensuring adequate resources, including force multipliers and enablers, as well as modern mechanical and technological instruments. Notwithstanding this progress, Djibouti is deeply disturbed by the continued erosion of compliance with international humanitarian law and international human rights law. In too many places, civilians in conflicts are vulnerable to the consequences of war. Instead of endeavoring to limit the barbarity of war with not deliberate targeting and killing of civilians, destruction of civilian infrastructure, including hospitals and schools. The integrity of UN facilities and premises must be protected at all times under international humanitarian law. Civilians must be protected in Sudan, Ukraine, and most terribly, Gaza, to mention just a few. Israel, which seems to have decreed Palestinians unfit to live, is committing wide-scale genocide in Gaza and continues to unashamedly rationalize the killing of civilians and the use of starvation as a method of warfare. The assault on Rafah will further compound a catastrophic humanitarian situation. Mr. President, these extremely negative developments threaten 25 years of progress. As we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Convention of 1949, let us recommit with renewed urgency to the implementation of international law and United Nations Security Council resolutions for the protection of civilians in armed conflicts and promote accountability. Djibouti, as a signatory of the political declaration on suspension of veto powers in cases of mass atrocities, calls on all states to consider lending their most valuable support to the crucial initiative launched by France and Mexico. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of Djibouti for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Bangladesh.
Mr. President, I thank the Presidency of Mozambique for convening this open debate. My delegation aligns itself with the statements made on behalf of the Group of Friends of Protection of Civilians in Armed Conflict and the Group of Friends of Responsibility to Protect. Mr. President, today's debate coincides with the 75th anniversary of 1949 Geneva Conventions, which represent the cornerstones of international humanitarian law, and the 25th anniversary of Security Council Resolution 1265, which recognized the need to protect civilians during armed conflicts in accordance with international law, including humanitarian law, human rights law, and refugee law. Sadly, today's debate also coincides with the most blatant display of disregard for the international norms related to protection of civilians. Civilians continue to account for the vast majority of casualties in situations of armed conflicts, especially in the course of current brutal aggression in Gaza, where they are exposed to indiscriminate killing, forced displacement, and starvation as a method of warfare, among others. We're also witnessing unlawful denial of access to humanitarian aid, attacks on medical personnel, humanitarian personnel exclusively engaged in medical duties, hospitals, and other medical facilities, intentional damage and unlawful destruction of civilian infrastructure, property, and livelihoods across multiple situations of armed conflict. In the Rakhine state of Myanmar, we are deeply concerned by the renewed instances of conflicts between the military and the armed groups, which left civilians, especially the Rohingya minorities, extremely vulnerable to atrocity crimes. The civilians, especially the young people and children, are reportedly being forcibly recruited and being used as human shields. Mr. President, owing to our own experience in Bangladesh's 1971 Liberation War, which saw killing of 3 million civilians and sexual violence against more than 200,000 women, we remain deeply committed to the United Nations POC agenda. Our peacekeepers have played a crucial role in putting the principle in practice when it was introduced for the first time in the United Nations Assistance Mission in Sierra Leone, UNAMSIL, back in 1999. Mr. President, allow me to highlight a few points. First, as recommended by the Secretary General in his latest and previous reports, states and parties to conflict must redouble their efforts to strengthen compliance with international humanitarian law and ensure accountability for violations. Ensuring accountability is critical, preventing recurrence of such heinous crimes in the future, to prevent recurrence of such heinous crimes in the future. In this regard, we appreciate the latest efforts of the ICC prosecutor to ensure accountability for the crimes committed in Gaza and express our full support to the ICC's competence, integrity, and independence as a court of law to hold perpetrators of such crimes accountable. Second, it is essential to ensure unhindered humanitarian access to the civilians in need during armed conflict, and also to ensure uninterrupted supply of life-saving materials to the people affected by conflicts. We express our concerns on the deliberate killing of and attacks against humanitarian and UN personnel and call for respect for and full compliance of international humanitarian law by all parties to the conflict. Third, UN peacekeepers have an important role in protecting the civilians in the areas they serve. While the mandate of the peacekeeping should be realistic to facilitate the protection of civilians, at the same time, a coordinated and coherent approach between PKOs, UN agencies, and the host country is needed for protecting the civilians during transitions and after the withdrawal of the missions by formulating appropriate action plans in coordination with local and international partners. Finally, Mr. President, I wish to refer to the Secretary General's proposed new agenda for peace, which calls for reduction of the human cost of weapons. We urge all member states to take collective and decisive actions towards banning transfer of weapons where its use is likely to cause civilian harms, and also reducing military expenditure. To conclude, Mr. President, I reiterate Bangladesh's strong commitment to ensure the protection of civilians. We will continue to contribute to the POC mandate of the United Nations through peacekeeping operations and other forms of engagements. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Bangladesh for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Kingdom of the Netherlands.
Mr. President, at the outset, I would like to thank Mozambique for organizing this important and humbling debate. The Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the statements by the European Union, the Group of Friends of the Protection of Civilians, and the statement delivered on behalf of the Group of Friends of Responsibility to Protect. The protection and safety of civilians, especially women and girls, remains a major challenge in many contexts and crises. Furthermore, it's extremely worrying that civilians increasingly become target of hostilities and violence, including sexual and gender-based violence. Addressing these issues requires a genuine commitment. It also requires an integrated approach across diverse thematic fields, including peace, security, humanitarian affairs, and efforts, human rights, gender, and development. In our national capacity, I would like to focus on three key areas for operationalization and strengthening of the protection of civilians: investing in prevention, prioritizing a people-centered approach, and incorporating mental health and psychosocial support into our strategies. Allow me, Mr. President, to briefly elaborate on each of these areas. Firstly, we must continuously invest in mechanisms to prevent conflicts and their recurrence. Prevention is more effective than cure. This includes preventing civilian harm where conflicts occur and within both peace enforcement and peacekeeping operations. Effective national protocols for civilian harm prevention and mitigation are crucial. Furthermore, enhancing the practical knowledge of international humanitarian law among armed actors is essential. Research shows that programs increasing international humanitarian law knowledge and and harm mitigation practices reduce civilian impact and shift decision-making towards protecting civilians. Secondly, we must prioritize a people-centered approach. By placing people at the heart of our efforts, our strategies become more effective, and they become more sustainable and responsive to the needs of those we aim to protect. This includes investing and empowering local protection and peace-building initiatives. Civil society and grassroots initiatives often play a key role in protecting across all conflict cycles and in transition settings. The Kingdom of the Netherlands is a proud long-term partner of many such organizations at the grassroots, national and international levels. Thirdly, and finally, we must recognize the importance of mental health and psychosocial support in our protection approaches. Research shows that repeated exposure to violence and traumatic events can exacerbate trauma symptoms amongst security actors. This, in turn, affects their mental health and increases the likelihood of violent interaction within communities and among those actors. Trauma also impedes reconciliation and long-term peace. Integrating mental health and psychosocial support helps mitigating these risks. Mr. President, I would like to conclude by saying we still have a lot of work to do in the area of protection of civilians, and the Kingdom of the Netherlands remains firmly committed to this cause. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Kingdom of the Netherlands for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Cambodia.
Mr. President, Excellency, distinguished delegate, at the outset, I wish to express my appreciation to you, Mr. President, for convening today's annual open debate on protection of civilians in armed conflict 25th anniversary of Security Council Resolution 1265. I also extend my gratitude to the esteemed briefer and speaker for their insightful remarks. As we mark the 25th anniversary of the 1216 resolution and the 75th anniversary of the 1949 Geneva Convention, it is disheartening that safeguarding civilians in armed conflict remains a significant concern. Mr. President, in this open debate, our thoughts are with those living under the shadow of war, whose lives are disrupted and whose future are uncertain. Cambodia's history stands as a touching reminder of this devastating impact of armed conflict on civilians. Our people have endured immense suffering, loss, and displacement during more than 3 decades of civil war. In the face of these ongoing challenges, I wish to emphasize 5 critical points. First, we must reinforce international humanitarian law and ensure its rigorous implementation. The Geneva Convention, the additional protocol, and the United Nations Security Council resolution provide a robust legal foundation for civilian protection. This legal instrument must be respected and enforced by all conflict parties. Cambodia calls upon the international community to hold violators accountable and support mechanisms that promote adherence to this legal standard. Second, we must enhance the capacity of peacekeeping missions to protect civilians. UN peacekeeping plays a crucial role in mitigating the impact of conflict on vulnerable populations. This mission must be adequate resource equipped and mandated to prioritize civilian protection. Cambodia reaffirmed its commitment to supporting this effort and called for greater international cooperation. Third, we must address the root cause of conflict to prevent violent outbreaks. Sustainable development, good governance, and respect for human rights are integral to building peaceful society. Cambodia's recovery and development journey demonstrate the transformative power of this principle. We urge all nations to invest in initiatives promoting social cohesion, economic opportunity, and the rule of law. Fourth, the protection of civilians requires addressing the specific needs of women and children, who are often disproportionately affected by conflict. Gender-based violence, children recruitment, and education disruption demand our immediate attention. Cambodia is committed to advancing gender equality and safeguarding children's rights, both within our border and in conflict-affected regions worldwide. Fifth, even after a war and danger for civilians can persist, Cambodia established the Cambodian Mine Action Center, CMAC, to clear landmines left behind by the conflict. Our goal is to make civilians completely safe from landmines by 2025. Taking this opportunity, my delegation invites all member states to attend the 5th Review Conference of the Ottawa Treaty to be held from 25 to 29 November this year, 2024, in Cambodia, under the theme Siem Reap Angkor Summit on the Mine-Free World. I believe that together we can join hands to free civilians from landmines. In conclusion, protecting civilians during armed conflict is a moral obligation that transcends national border and political ideology. Cambodia's history highlights the devastating impact of war and the enduring significance of peace. Our dedication to peace and the protection of civilians aim to prevent the recurrence of past atrocity. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Cambodia for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Estonia.
President, we thank Mozambique for convening today's important debate and the briefers for their presentations. Estonia aligns itself with a statement delivered by the European Union. As we commemorate the 25th anniversary of the UN Security Council Resolution 1265 and the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions, the cornerstone of international humanitarian law, we regretfully continue to witness an erosion of catastrophic proportions of the exact same principles enshrined in these documents. This year's report by the Secretary General describes an unprecedented scale of violations against civilians across the globe, including in Yemen, Sudan, Gaza, and Ukraine. The report provides a stark reality. Civilian deaths in armed conflicts have increased 72% compared to previous year. The number of women and children killed in conflicts have respectively doubled and tripled. Armed conflicts remain the major driver of global hunger, acute food insecurity, and displacement of civilians everywhere. Estonia is deeply concerned about the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Gaza and calls for continued, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access, which allows for a continued and sufficient flow of humanitarian assistance. This month we delivered 120,000 euro support to UN organizations, including UNRWA, providing humanitarian aid in Gaza. President, since the beginning of the year, we have seen an increase on 40% in children being killed in Ukraine, according to UNICEF, due to ongoing barbaric attacks by Russia on civilian infrastructure, including residential areas, schools, and health facilities. We continue to witness Russia's deliberate, systematic attacks against the Ukrainian energy infrastructure, posing a threat to millions of civilians. In this situation of total impunity, the deliberate mass violations of international humanitarian law have become a tool in UN permanent member Russia's conventional warfare. Russia's use of explosive weapons in populated areas, including highly destructive glide bombs and landmines, continues to be the primary cause of casualties among the civilian population in Ukraine. 30% of Ukraine's territory is littered with mines, which makes it one of the most heavily mine-contaminated countries in the world. This has seriously limited Ukraine's agriculture and food production, as well as trade, and caused unprecedented environmental damage. This is why Estonia has provided Ukraine demining equipment and training, and we continue to explore ways how else to support Ukraine. President, The constant attacks also make it impossible for human rights defenders to access and conduct monitoring and reporting, including on conflict-related sexual violence. Hence, Estonia strongly welcomes the Security Council's increased focus on tracking developments on the ground through monitoring mechanisms, including on conflict-related sexual violence and on grave violations against children in armed conflicts, as outlined in OCHA's updated policy brief from April. We also draw attention to 35 journalists killed in armed conflicts in 2023, as reported by UNESCO. This once again underlines the urgency to implement Security Council Resolution 2222 on the protection of journalists. President, to conclude, in light of extreme violations of fundamental international humanitarian law and international human rights law, including the increase in brutal killings and harm done to civilians globally, Estonia echoes the Secretary General's call for all UN member states to redouble their efforts and strengthen compliance by parties to conflict with international humanitarian and human rights law, as well as ensure accountability. Let us mark the 75th year of the Geneva Conventions by making a stronger commitment to the principles of international humanitarian law, including the protection of civilians. It is more important than ever. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Estonia for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, let me start by congratulating you and the delegation of Mozambique on a very successful presidency of the Security Council. Mr. President, we thank you for organizing this important debate on the protection of civilians in armed conflict, and we thank the briefers for their thoughtful insights. Mr. President, it is 25 years since the Security Council commenced consideration of the protection of civilians in armed conflicts. This year is also the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions, which made explicit the protections for civilians in conflict zones. It is therefore with outrage that we witness the wanton war being waged for the past 7 months against helpless Palestinian civilians in Gaza. 35,000 mostly innocent women and children have been killed by the Israeli war machine in this brutal campaign. 2 million Gazans have been displaced repeatedly. Humanitarian supplies have been deliberately blocked, humanitarian workers targeted and killed, hospitals, schools, and infrastructure destroyed, and UNRWA, the only UN agency fully capable of providing relief to the besieged Gazans, has been deliberately defamed and attacked. Famine and pestilence stalk Gaza. Mr. President, this plausible genocide, as termed by the International Court of Justice, will forever remain a blot on the world's conscience. It will haunt the perpetrators of this slaughter. It has sullied the reputation of those who were complicit in the Israeli crimes by offering impunity to the extremist Israeli leadership. The prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has sought arrest warrants, including for 2 of Israel's leaders. This will be a test case for the credibility of the ICC. Mr. President, it is difficult to build protections for civilians when their suppression, exclusion, and expulsion is the very object of a military campaign. As in Palestine, a pervasive campaign of oppression has been underway for decades in occupied Jammu and Kashmir, executed by an army of 900,000 troops acting with complete impunity to impose what is ominously called a final solution for the Kashmir dispute. Over 100,000 Kashmiris have been killed. 13,000 young Kashmiri boys have been abducted, and many of them mercilessly tortured. All those Kashmiri leaders seeking freedom and self-determination for the people of Jammu and Kashmir, as prescribed by the several resolutions of this Security Council, all of them have been incarcerated. Many of these political leaders have died in custody under suspicious circumstances. Extrajudicial killings continue. Collective punishments are frequent. Mr. President, Pakistan has submitted a dossier to the United Nations with evidence of 2,800 cases of crimes committed by Indian officials against Kashmiri civilians in occupied Jammu and Kashmir. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and more than a dozen special rapporteurs of the Human Rights Council have expressed deep concern regarding the massive violations of human rights in occupied Jammu and Kashmir and sought investigations. All their requests for access to the occupied territory have been denied. Mr. President, it is imperative for the Security Council and other United Nations bodies to redress such violations, to end foreign occupation, and to promote the right of self-determination for the Kashmiri and Palestinian people. It is essential to address the underlying causes of these conflicts, promote political solutions, and ensure the observance of international humanitarian law, and end the impunity for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The Security Council can contribute to this by holding the perpetrators of war crimes accountable, by halting the supply of weapons to the perpetrators, by imposing political and legal consequences on the states and individuals responsible for these crimes, and by offering protection, including through UN peacekeepers, to the civilians suffering under the yoke of foreign occupation. Mr. President, the adoption of Resolution 2719 was an important milestone in building credible avenues for the protection of civilians, including through peace enforcement. We must build on this example of enforcement actions. Apart from political actions to resolve disputes, apart from reinforced legal mechanisms to ensure accountability, we must build the UN's capacity, together with relevant regional organizations, including the African Union, to enforce peace and uphold the protection of civilians in conflict zones, in accordance with the principles and norms of international law, in particular, international humanitarian law. Mr. President, Pakistan looks forward to working for these objectives within the Security Council and at the forthcoming Summit of the Future. I thank you, sir.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for their statement I now give the floor to the representative of the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you.
Monsieur le Président, comme c'est la première fois que je prends la parole devant le Conseil de sécurité en ce mois de mai 2024, je voudrais saluer votre présidence du Conseil et vous rassurer de l'excellente collaboration de ma délégation. Je voudrais également saluer et remercier l'assistante du secrétaire général pour les affaires humanitaires, Madame Masuya, pour sa contribution vitale dans ce débat crucial. Monsieur le Président, cette célébration de 25 ans de la résolution 1267 du Conseil de sécurité sur la protection des civils coïncide douloureusement pour mon pays, la République démocratique du Congo,
This coincided with a painful event for my country, the DRC, with the recent burial in Goma, to our horror, of many people, mostly women and children.
Des civils innocents lâchement massacrés le 3 mai 2024 dans
Civilians
le
who were
camp
killed
des
in a cowardly
déplacés
manner on the
internes
3rd of May
de
2024 in the
Mugunga, dans le Nord
IDP
Kivu,
camp of
par la
Mugunga in
coalition des
North
troupes de
Kivu
l'armée rwandaise
by the coalition
RDF
of troops
et le
of the
terroriste
Rwandese
du
army
M23
RDF and the
qui, comme dans leurs
M23
habitudes, ont
terrorists
délibérément
who, as
foulé
is
aux
their
pieds
wont,
les
deliberately
règles du
trampled
droit
underfoot the
international
rules
qui
of
régissent
international
la
law which
conduite des
govern
hostilités
the conduct of
et qui font des
hostilities
camps de
and
déplacés
which
internes
classify internally
des
displaced
entités
persons
protégées
camps
par le
as
droit
protected
international.
entities under international law.
Comme vous le savez, le
As
bilan
you
de
know,
cette
the
extermination des
toll
populations
of this
congolaises
extermination
ne
of
commence
Congolese
pas par
people
ce
did not
dernier massacre
begin
de
with this
Mugunga.
latest
Ça
massacre
fait
in
plus de
Mugunga.
25 ans
For more
que
than
les populations
25
civiles de
years,
l'Est de la
the
République
civilians of
démocratique
the
du
east
Congo
of the Democratic Republic
subissent
of the
les
Congo
affres de la
have been
barbarie
suffering the
de l'agression
barbarity of the
rwandaise
Rwandan
sous couvert des
aggression,
différentes
veiled as
pseudo-rébellions
any number of
dites
allegedly
congolaises,
Congolese
mais en réalité
pseudo-rebellions,
made
but which
in Rwanda,
are in fact
comme le
made in
RCD,
Rwanda, such
le
as the
CNDP,
RCD,
le
the
M23
CNDP,
première et
the
deuxième version.
M23 in both its
Plus
first
de
and
11
second
millions de
embodiments.
morts,
Over 11 million
7,2
deaths,
millions de
7.2
personnes
million
déplacées.
displaced persons.
Toujours à titre d'illustration,
Still,
le
by
plus
way of
récent rapport
illustration, the
du
most
secrétaire
recent
général
report of the Secretary
sur la
General
protection
on
des civils,
the protection of
document
civilians, document
S/2024/385 du 14 mai 2024, dont ce Conseil est saisi,
which
fait
this
état
Council is
à son
examining,
paragraphe 7
notes
de
in
plus de
paragraph
219 000 victimes
over
civiles enregistrées
219,000
en République
civilian
démocratique
victims
du Congo.
registered in the
219
DRC.
000 civils congolais, rien que pour
219,000
l'année
Congolese
2023.
civilians in
C'est
2023
scandaleux.
alone.
Et c'est ça, la
That is
réalité de
scandalous, and it is
l'extermination
the stark
des
reality
populations de
of
mon
the
pays.
extermination of my
Et
country's
c'est
people.
la seule richesse
This
que le
is the
Rwanda
only
voisin
wealth that
a
neighboring
réussi
Rwanda
à
has been able to
exporter dans la
export
partie est de la
to the
République
east of
démocratique
the
du
Democratic
Congo
Republic
en
of the
échange
Congo.
du
In
pillage
exchange
systématique
for the
de nos
systematic
minerais
plundering
stratégiques
of our
auxquels se livre
strategic
ce
mineral
pays,
ore, which
ses
is carried
troupes
out by
et
this
les
country, its
terroristes du
troops, and the
M23.
terrorists of the M23.
Mais je voudrais rassurer nos
But I would like
agresseurs
to
que le
reassure
peuple
our
congolais,
attackers
dont
that the
ils ont
Congolese
déjà
people,
mesuré la
whose
capacité de
resilience they have
résilience,
already
se
witnessed
battra jusqu'au
in
bout
the past, will
afin que
fight
chaque
to the
millimètre
end,
carré
so that
de son
each
territoire
square
actuellement occupé
millimeter of
par
its
l'armée
territory, which is
rwandaise
currently
soit
occupied by the
récupéré
Rwandan army,
et
will
sa
be recovered,
souveraineté
and
totalement
its sovereignty
restaurée.
will be entirely
Monsieur le
restored.
Président, mon pays,
President,
fort de ses
as a
expériences
result
douloureuses,
of our painful
apprécie à sa
experiences, my
juste valeur
country
le
appreciates
concept de
the
la
importance
protection
of
des
the
civils.
concept of protection of
Il entend
civilians.
pour ce faire
It
participer
therefore
pleinement
intends
et de
to
manière
fully
constructive
participate
à
in
ce
a
débat
constructive manner
porteur
in this
d'espoir
debate,
pour l'avenir. Ma
which
délégation propose
is hopeful for the future. My
un
delegation firstly
réaménagement des
proposes
États
a
en
recommitment
faveur
of
de la
states to the
centralité
central
des
role
normes qui
of
fondent
the norms
notre
which
sécurité collective,
underpin our collective
le respect
security.
de la Charte des Nations Unies,
Respect for the Charter of the
ainsi que
United Nations
de
and for
l'arsenal
the
juridique
international
international
legal
en
arsenal
matière
which
de
we have
protection
for the
des
protection of
civils en
civilians
période de
during
conflit
conflicts
doit
must be
être renforcé.
bolstered.
2. Ce
Secondly,
Conseil doit
this Council
confier
must provide
aux opérations
United
de paix
Nations peace
des Nations
operations
Unies
with
des mandats plus que
crystal
clairs
clear
quant à la
mandates
protection des civils
with regard to the
afin de
protection of
prévenir des
civilians,
crises
so as to
de
prevent
confiance
crises of
entre ces
confidence
civils et les
between
casques bleus
the civilians
des
and
Nations
the blue
Unies
helmets of the
appelés à les
United
protéger
Nations who are
dans les
called
zones de
to
conflit.
provide
3.
protection to
Le
conflict
Conseil de
zones.
sécurité doit
Thirdly,
demeurer
the Security
une
Council
plateforme
must
de
remain
régulation de
a
notre notre sécurité
platform to
collective,
regulate our collective
débarrassée de toute
security and must remain
sélectivité et de
untouched
tout toute
by any
division
selectivity
intérieure.
or internal
Cet
division.
organe doit se
This
remettre en
body
question
must call
et
itself
être
into question
réformé.
and be
Il doit
reformed.
démocratiser ses méthodes de
It
travail
must
pour
provide
retrouver
greater
toute son
democracy to
efficacité
its
et
working
toute son
methods so as to
utilité.
recover its full
3.
effectiveness
Au
and
niveau
utility.
conceptuel, il
Thirdly,
est
in
impérieux
conceptual
de
terms,
repenser en
it is
profondeur
crucial to
la stratégie
rethink in
collective en
depth
matière de
the
protection des
collective
civils.
strategy
Il
for
faudrait
protection of
envisager
civilians.
des concepts de POC
Innovative
innovants qui
POC
offrent des
concepts
meilleures
must be
alternatives
adopted to
pour faire
provide
face
better
à toutes les
alternatives
formes
to
de
address
violence
all
contre les
forms
civils.
of violence against
4.
civilians.
Les Nations Unies
Fourthly, the
doivent
United
investir
Nations must
beaucoup plus dans
invest
une
much more
optique d'accompagnement
in
optimal
ensuring
nettement
optimal
orienté
support, which
vers
is clearly
l'appropriation de
aimed
la
at
protection des
ensuring
civils par le pays
ownership
hôte.
of
Ceci
protection of
implique
civilians
un
by the
appui
host
à
country.
l'élaboration d'une
This
stratégie
involves
nationale intégrée
support for
de
drawing
POC,
up an integrated
appui à
national
la réforme
POC
du
strategy
secteur de la
and support
sécurité.
for the security
Enfin,
sector reform.
la consolidation des
Finally, there
partenariats
must be a
à tous les
consolidation
niveaux,
of partnerships at all
continental,
levels,
régional
continental,
et sous-régional.
regional and sub-regional.
Face aux défis des technologies
Given
émergentes,
the
il faut
emerging
innover
technology
pour
challenges, there is a
s'adapter,
need to innovate, to
exploiter au mieux
adapt,
ces technologies
and seize
au
the
bénéfice
potential of these
de
technologies
POC.
to benefit
Monsieur
the
le
protection
Président,
of
je vous
civilians.
remercie.
I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of the Democratic Republic of the Congo for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Liberia.
Thank you, Mr. President, for chairing this important meeting. Mr. President, as we observe the United Nations Protection of Civilians Week, we are reminded of the growing urgency to protect civilians in areas of armed conflicts. Recent global events underscore the critical need for coordinated international efforts to uphold peace and security. Mr. President, we are all connected. Instability in one region can affect global safety, evident through the ongoing calamity of civilian sufferings, refugee flows, and the violation of human rights laws or crimes against humanity. My delegation commends the continuous efforts of the United Nations, particularly the Security Council, for their dedication to enhancing and fortifying strategies for civilian protection during conflicts. Historic legal frameworks such as Resolutions 1265 and 1296, and later 1674 and 2086, have set significant precedents for the protection of civilians during conflicts. Yet, the persistence of deliberate attacks and the use of explosive weapons in populated areas highlight that much remains to be done to ensure compliance with international laws and effectively safeguard civilians. Mr. President, this year's commemoration of the POC Week occurred amid an increasingly polarized geopolitical landscape presenting formidable challenges to global peace and security. The complexities of urban warfare and the involvement of non-state armed groups exacerbate these challenges. This is further compounded by inadequate and weak international cooperation and the emerging threat posed by advanced technologies. In response to these critical issues, Liberia aligns with the UN Secretary General's latest report, which emphasizes the urgent need to curtail the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Proudly, Liberia has endorsed the political declaration on explosive weapons in populated areas, a proactive measure following our own prolonged civil conflicts. This declaration is instrumental in mitigating harm to civilians and shaping military conduct towards prioritizing civilian protection. We urge other member states to endorse this declaration and call upon humanitarian organizations, civil society, and affected communities to intensify their advocacies. Mr. President, the stark reality is that resolutions alone are not enough. Effective action and strict enforcement of international laws are essential to truly protect civilians. This week, let us commit to deep reflection and renew our commitment to cooperative global actions by ensuring the security and dignity of civilians. We safeguard ourselves and contribute to maintaining international peace and security. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Liberia for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Myanmar.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, at the outset, I wish to express my appreciation to the Presidency of Mozambique for organizing this open debate. I thank the briefers for their insightful statements. I also thank the Secretary General for his annual report on protection of civilians in armed conflict, in which the situation of Myanmar is highlighted. As we mark the 25th anniversary of the Security Council Resolution 1265, this open debate offers an opportunity for the Council members and the UN member states to reflect on the progress and challenges on this agenda, as well as to redouble our efforts to strengthen compliance with international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and enhance accountability for their violations. It is imperative for the Security Council to take a responsible role to ensure that the provisions of the Resolution 1265 are implemented by the holding perpetrators accountable for their violations of IHL and IHRL. If no timely action or accountability measures is taken, it will perpetuate a vicious cycle where the lack of compliance with IHL is exacerbated by the culture of impunity. Unfortunately, the people in my country, Myanmar, are witnessing this phenomenon on a daily basis. Since the attempted military coup in 2021, the military junta has brutally killed over 5,100 people, over 3 million people have been internally displaced, and more than 18.6 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance. Nearly 90,000 private properties were burned down or destroyed. The military juntas deliberately attacked the health sectors in Myanmar over 1,293 times and damaged 343 health facilities and killed 104 health workers. In addition to committing attacks against the humanitarian workers, the military junta has imposed the so-called compulsory organization registration on NGOs to restrict their movement and weaponize aid. Regarding Myanmar, the Secretary General in his report highlighted that, I quote, the military, contrary to humanitarian principles, make decisions on who would receive assistance and the timing and type of assistance, end quote. Moreover, the military's unlawful forced conscription has also pushed many young people into hiding or fleeing from the country. In Rakhine State, it is disturbingly learned that some Rohingya have been forcefully recruited by the military junta and used them as human shield. In its statement on the situation in Budidao, northern Rakhine, yesterday, the National Unity Government called for the cessation of all attacks on the civilians and civilian properties, and for protection of civilians and property. The military juntas is purportedly making intercommunal conflict by creating chaos and the large-scale destruction, bombing, and area attacks on the villages. Rakhine, Rohingya, and Hindu civilians are being forced to move and their houses are being burned. Mr. President, The current trajectory in Myanmar shows the intensifications of conflicts followed by unabated violence and indiscriminate attacks by the military juntas against the civilian population. It is clear that the military continues to disregard the demands of this council by committing more atrocity with impunity, and it is because of the lack of accountability mechanism by the international community. The Security Council should take the initiative to fill the accountability gaps by referring the situation of Myanmar to the ICC and adopting an enforcement resolution as a follow-up to the resolution 2669. I myself and the people of Myanmar have repeatedly appealed the international community, in particular this Security Council, to help save lives by taking effective actions. Disappointedly, our voices, our appeals have been ignored. The ignorance of our voices by the international community and the Security Council have resulted in deaths of so many innocent people, including Rohingya, as well as destruction of homes, including those in Rakhine State. Many now said that the international community is also responsible for deaths of civilians and failure of the protection of civilians in Myanmar. While awaiting effective action from the UN Security Council, I wish to request the international community to provide adequate protection for all of our people, including respecting the principles of non-refoulement. Here, I thank the UNHCR for issuance of guidance notes on the international protection needs of people fleeing Myanmar earlier this month. In its guidance note, UNHCR called on all states to allow civilians fleeing Myanmar access to their territories, to guarantee the right to seek asylum, and to respect for the principles of non-refoulement at all times. It is also called on states to register all individuals who seek international protection and issue documentary proof of registration to all consent. Mr. President, meanwhile, the National Unity Government continues to emphasize the importance of promoting POC and issue the military code of conduct for People's Defense Forces in March this year. It includes, among others, People's Defense Forces shall respect international humanitarian law and international human rights laws. Violations shall be seriously charged in accordance with the existing laws, shall not physically, mentally, and sexually assault by any civilian. In conclusion, Mr. President, securing compliance with the international humanitarian law and enforcing accountability mechanisms are central to the full protection of civilians. Immediate accountability measures by the Security Council in conjunction with the restriction of flow of arms, weapons, and money, as well as the jet fuel to the military junta will bring us closer to our collective aspiration of saving lives, ending the military dictatorship, and building a federal democratic union. The Security Council should act now to bring tangible protection for the people of Myanmar. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Myanmar for their statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Paul Beresford Hill, Permanent Observer of the Sovereign Order of Malta to the United Nations.
Mr. President, distinguished delegates, we would like to thank the delegation of the Republic of Mozambique for facilitating our contribution to this vital discussion. We also extend our gratitude to all of the briefers for their insightful presentations. As we share this open debate on the protection of civilians in armed conflict, we do mark significant milestones. The 25th anniversary of the Security Council Resolution 1265, which first introduced the protection of civilians as an item on the Security Council's agenda, and the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Convention's foundational texts in international humanitarian law. As this year's Secretary General's annual report mentions the harms that civilians are experiencing, include death, attacks on essential infrastructure, conflict-induced hunger, the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, and conflict-related sexual violence. These atrocities are evident across all conflict zones. Our response must be comprehensive and it must be determined. The Sovereign Order of Malta, with a 900-year mission of aiding those in need, is deeply committed to the protection of civilians in armed conflict. Our humanitarian arm, Malteser International, has been at the forefront of providing aid to civilians affected by conflict, particularly focus on the needs of migrants and refugees. Through our extensive network, we offer medical aid, psychological support, essential supplies to those in dire circumstances, working tirelessly to uphold the principles of humanity and impartiality. We have recently heard from distinguished colleagues about the deteriorating humanitarian situation in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Decades of ongoing conflict there have displaced 7.2 million people internally and forced over 5.3 million to seek refuge in neighboring countries. A renewed outbreak of violence this autumn has displaced further 1 million people. In response, the Sovereign Order of Malta is actively engaged in addressing the needs of displaced and vulnerable populations. Our mobile clinics in the camps treat those injured by gunfire and bombs, offering essential medical care in these challenging environments. Approximately 1.1 million children under the age of 5 and 605,000 pregnant and breastfeeding women are acutely malnourished. Our nutrition centers have seen a quadrupling of severely malnourished children since November 2023. And to address this, we are distributing emergency food supplies, strengthening medical care for malnourished children, and gender-based violence remains a significant concern, with displaced women and girls at high risk. The escalating violence and instability in Haiti is causing widespread displacement and suffering, putting civilians at significant risk. The Sovereign Order of Malta has been active in Haiti since 2010, focusing on nutritional assistance, food security, and income-generating opportunities, particularly for women. Despite the challenges, our commitment to supporting the Haitian people remains steadfast and constant. We provide supplementary food to malnourished children, supporting pregnant women, ensuring long-term food security through sustainable agricultural projects and vocational training. Our teams, active now on the ground, distribute medical supplies and offer healthcare services in areas with limited access due to gang control. Ukraine remains a state of conflict, resulting in significant civilian casualties and widespread displacement. Since November 2022, 3 mobile teams have been active offering psychosocial support to displaced young children and young people. This initiative, managed by Malteser International and the Johanniter Orden, the German Protestant Alliance of Orders of St. John, and staffed by Ukrainian Relief Service of the Order of Malta, especially equipped 6 vehicles stocked with materials for group encounters, activities, toys and games, and activities for young children, fostering an environment conducive to mental health and support. In addition to medical aid, we distribute food, water, essential supplies, and support the reconstruction of damaged infrastructure, such as schools and hospitals. Palestine, one of the world's most challenging environments. Civilians face severe restrictions on movement, lack of access to basic services, and ongoing violence. The Order of Malta has a long-standing presence there because we were founded in Jerusalem with a mission of caring for pilgrims, but of all faiths and all origins. And despite the ongoing hostilities, our hospital in Bethlehem delivers, even now, over 4,500 babies annually, and is the only facility in the region with an intensive neonatal ward. This hospital serves the catchment area for over 1 million people and is a critical reference point for women's and children's health. Just last week, Fra Alessandro de Francis, our Minister of Health, along with Cardinal Pizzaballa, the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, made a trip through the West Bank into Gaza and reached the parish of the Holy Family for a pastoral visit. There they met a suffering population, and they encouraged them, and they went and they delivered them a message of hope, telling them that they were not forgotten, that we are in solidarity with their needs, and that we support the suffering that they are enduring and want to alleviate it as quickly and as soon as possible. This visit is the first in the stage of joint humanitarian missions of the Latin Patriarchate and the Sovereign Order of Malta, aiming at the delivery of life-saving food and medical help to the people of Gaza. The harms experienced by civilians during conflict are multifaceted and severe. Direct attacks on civilians, the use of human shields, the misuse of protected facilities, and the targeting of humanitarian aid workers are unacceptable violations of international humanitarian law. These actions not only cause immediate harm, but also have long-term repercussions on the stability and development of affected regions. That is why it is critical to ensure compliance with international humanitarian law. International organizations play a crucial role in addressing these issues. It is imperative that we continue to support and strengthen the efforts of civil society and other organizations working on the ground, and that we do more to protect the sick and the poor, because failure to do so is not only an affront to humanity, but it makes a mockery of Resolution 1265. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Beresford Hill for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Maldives.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Mozambique, the President of the Council, for the month of May for convening this open debate. We are marking the 25th anniversary of Resolution 1265 at an inflection point in history. The International Criminal Court is considering to issue arrest warrants against Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel Defense Minister Yoav Gallant to hold them accountable for war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in Palestine. It is a welcoming development. We welcome the filing of the application for these arrest warrants by the ICC prosecutor. But Maldives believes that this is a step that should have been taken much earlier, as the continuous aggression and genocidal acts being perpetuated by Israel are undeniable and apparent. Justice delayed is justice denied. Governments around the world and members of the Security Council, too, have a stark choice to make. Do you want justice to prevail and hold offenders accountable, or do you keep encouraging genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity to continue? We must uphold the rule of law, international human rights and humanitarian law, especially when it is most inconvenient to do so. Israel's violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention is happening in front of our own eyes. The UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs reported that 40% of Gaza's population, or more than 900,000 people, have been forcibly displaced by Israel in the last 2 weeks alone. Since 7th October 2023, more than 35,000 people have been killed and nearly 80,000 wounded in Israel's attack on Gaza. Most of them are women and children. Israel's attack on civilians are not results of mistakes in a war. It is the result of its current government's genocidal ideology. Israel's disregard for civilians has been spelled out by its own ministers and its own soldiers on the front line. Israeli cabinet ministers refer to Palestinians as subhuman. Israeli soldiers stand claiming that there are no innocent civilians in Palestine. The genocidal intent is glaringly evident in Israel's actions: the blocking of crucial humanitarian aid to Palestine, the deliberate attacks on homes, hospitals, and schools. The Maldives calls on the Security Council to take immediate action to protect Palestinian civilians. The Council needs no reminding of its failure in taking actions to prevent the genocide in Rwanda in 1994 and the genocide in Srebrenica in Bosnia in 1995. Members of this Council said in this chamber then, never again. But some 30 years later, we are witnessing genocidal acts being committed again and again by Israel. Israel must be held accountable for its crimes. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Maldives for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Azerbaijan.
Mr. President, at the outset, I would like to thank the delegation of Mozambique for having convened this important annual open debate. Mr. President, the developments in our region since the fall of 2020 culminated in the end of the 30-year occupation by Armenia of the territories of Azerbaijan and the restoration of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of my country in full accordance with the Charter of the United Nations, international humanitarian and human rights law, and the relevant resolutions adopted by this Council in 1993. The ongoing efforts to normalize relations between Azerbaijan and Armenia based on mutual respect for each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity inspire hope for long-awaited sustainable and lasting peace and stability in the region. The Secretary General and a number of international organizations and governments welcomed the recent progress achieved as a result of direct negotiations between the two countries. At the same time, the consequences of war continue to impact civilians. In the liberated territories, we have discovered ruined cities, destroyed and desecrated cultural monuments, and a devastated environment. The conflict also turned Azerbaijan into one of the most heavily mine-contaminated countries in the world, with an estimated 1.5 million landmines and unknown number of explosive remnants of war, posing severe risks to civilians, hindering the safe return of internally displaced persons to their homes in the liberated territories and delaying the essential reconstruction and development works there. Despite the end of the conflict, Armenia has failed to share complete and accurate information about the locations of the minefields it has deliberately laid in civilian areas in Azerbaijan. Yesterday, on the day of this open debate, another civilian in my country was killed by a landmine, bringing the number of post-conflict mine victims in Azerbaijan to 360, of whom 68 lost their lives and 292 suffered horrific injuries. Half of them are civilians, including children and women. In total, over the past 30 years, the number of mine victims in Azerbaijan has reached 3,439 people. The scale and gravity of the landmine threat in Azerbaijan necessitates urgent, continued, and adequate international support to its demining efforts. The need to clarify the fate and whereabouts of some 4,000 missing Azerbaijani nationals is another pressing humanitarian issue. International humanitarian law imposes specific obligations with regard to the search for missing persons and the treatment of the dead, including by recovering and returning human remains and identifying, mapping, and preserving mass graves and other burial sites. Mr. President, states are under the obligation not only to prevent, but also to punish the most serious crimes. This obligation has been repeatedly reaffirmed by the Security Council. Thus, in this resolution 1265, 1999, the 25th anniversary of which we mark this year, the Council emphasized the responsibility of states to end impunity and prosecute those responsible for such crimes. In a similar vein, in his latest report on the protection of civilians in armed conflicts, document S/2024/385, the Secretary General underlined that states should ensure that commitments to strengthen protection and investigate violations are matched by practical and effective measures. Azerbaijan has taken concrete steps to investigate and prosecute mass atrocities committed against its civilians and other protected persons during the conflict, in full accordance with its national legislation and international obligations. However, most of the perpetrators, having found a safe haven in Armenia, including those responsible for the genocide against Azerbaijan civilians in the town of Khojaly in February 1992, continue to enjoy impunity. The denial and ignorance of these crimes constitute a clear contempt for international law and justice. In conclusion, with regard to the statement made by the representative of Armenia at this open debate, it is critical for further progress towards achieving lasting peace and stability in the region that this country strictly abide by its international obligations and stop replicating its false narratives that are counterproductive for the normalization process. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Azerbaijan for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, let me thank the Presidency of Mozambique for convening this important debate. Georgia aligns itself with the statement delivered earlier by the European Union, and I would like to make some additional comments in my national capacity. The UN Security Council has a leading role in strengthening the normative framework for the protection of civilians in armed conflicts. With the landmark resolution 1265 on the protection of civilians in armed conflict, the Security Council set out a holistic and comprehensive agenda for the protection of civilians aimed at enhancing compliance with international law and ensuring protection of vulnerable groups, including internally displaced persons, women, and children. We are deeply concerned by the findings of the Secretary General's latest report that armed conflicts continue to cause enormous human casualties, damage or destruction of vital infrastructure, and disruption of critical services. Among others, Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine has dramatically impacted the lives of millions of civilians and resulted in continued and massive displacement. We strongly condemn the indiscriminate escalated strikes against civilians and civilian infrastructure. We reiterate our call on Russia to comply with the provisional measures of the ICJ of 16 March 2022. Immediately cease the aggression, completely and unconditionally withdrew all its troops and military equipment from the whole territory of Ukraine. The only way to protect civilians in armed conflicts is to respect international humanitarian law and international human rights law. In this context, Georgia remains committed to ensuring the protection of international humanitarian and human rights laws at both national and international levels. The government has established dedicated body and relevant mechanisms to ensure respect for international humanitarian law. On the international level, Georgia actively supports relevant initiatives such as political declaration on the protection of humanitarian and medical personnel in armed conflicts and the Safe Schools Declaration. Here we would also like to welcome the ongoing Protection of Civilian Week 2024 and thank its organizers, Switzerland, the Center for Civilians in Conflict, International Rescue Committee, and UN OCHA. I would like to highlight that the Georgian government is determined to protect its civilian population affected by Russia's continuous military aggression, starting from the early 1990s and leading to the full-scale armed attack in August 2008. However, we are unable to protect our population in Abkhazia and Skhinvali regions of Georgia due to Russia's illegal occupation of these territories. The conflict-affected people living on the other side of the occupation line continue to face grave human rights violations. Restrictions of the freedom of movement, denial of access to health care, and the prohibition of education in native language and other forms of discrimination are among the negative consequences of the Russian occupation. Regretfully, tragic events have become a permanent practice, such as the murder of Georgian citizens Tamaz Ginturi and Vitali Temur Karbaya in the last fall by the Russian occupation forces. The practice of illegal detention and kidnapping of Georgian citizens is intensifying every year. Especially vulnerable groups are women, elderly children, and people with severe health problems. Illegal occupation and effective control of Georgia's Abkhazia and Skhinvali regions by the Russian Federation and its responsibility for grave human rights violations therein have been legally attested by the numerous judgments of the European Court of Human Rights and decision of Chief Prosecutor of International Criminal Court. In conclusion, while we reiterate our commitment to the protection of civilians in armed conflicts, we call on the international community to urge Russia to cease its provocative and destructive actions in the illegally occupied regions of Georgia and start fulfillment of its international obligations. First and foremost, the EU-mediated 12th of August 2008 ceasefire agreement, withdraw its forces from the territory of Georgia, and return of all IDPs and refugees to their homes based on the fundamental principles of international law. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Georgia for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Saudi Arabia.
بداية السيد الرئيس اسمحوا لي أن أتقدم لكم التهنئة الخالصة على توليكم أعمال المجلس راجيا لكم
on your accession to the presidency of the Security Council, and I wish you every success. I also wish to take this opportunity to thank Madam Miriam Aguirre, President of the ICRC, Madam Joyce Nsuya, Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy Emergency Coordinator, and Madam Alice Nderiutu, a Special Advisor to the Secretary General on the Prevention of Genocide, and Mr. Hisham Kadrivi, Executive Director of the Center for Civilians in Conflict. We wish to thank them for their thorough briefings and for the tireless and exceptional efforts that they have been undertaking for the protection of civilians during armed conflict. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, the Security Council has gathered today to mark the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions, the 1949 Geneva Convention. And this coincides with the commemoration of the 25th anniversary of the adoption by the Security Council of Resolution 1265. These are opportunities which are of critical importance when it comes to underlining the importance of international humanitarian law. They reflect the unity and the willingness of the international community to protect civilians and their fundamental rights. during periods of armed conflict. Resolution 1265 reaffirms the nexus between protection of civilians and international peace and security. This is a true feat insofar as the resolution enshrines the competency of the Security Council to uphold the core principles of IHL. We have a duty, all of us, to see to the implementation of the resolution and to surmount obstacles and challenges that prevent the application of IHL as a whole. Almost 1 century has elapsed since the adoption of the core legal provisions in the area of the protection of civilians and the drafting of various legal frameworks which govern war and conflict throughout the world. Unfortunately, we have continued to bear witness to recurrent violations against innocent civilians. We all have taken note of the latest annual report of the Secretary General and the troubling information that has been set out therein related to the exacerbation of violations of IHL in areas of conflict. Mr. President, it is difficult for us as we discuss the question of the protection of civilians during conflict. Difficult for us to face the brutal events taking place in the Gaza Strip. The world has been observing on a daily basis myriad international crimes, the targeting of civilians, systematic starvation, obstacles to the delivery of humanitarian assistance, and the forced displacement of people, indiscriminate bombing of civilian infrastructure and medical facilities, the targeting of national and international humanitarian workers, and the hermetic siege imposed by the occupying military power. All of these practices are a clear example of the collective punishment against the innocent residents of the Gaza Strip. Up until the present point, nearly 35,000 people, more than 35,000 people have been killed in Gaza, and more than 79,000 have been wounded. These are practices which are a violent shock to the human conscience. Respect for the law of protection of civilians during conflict under all circumstances is non-negotiable, and this is the responsibility of the Security Council. This council, unfortunately, has remained incapable of shouldering the responsibility to protect civilians, and unfortunately has been riven by tensions and political divisions for the advancement of the parochial interests of certain. This has allowed the Israeli war machine to pursue its inhumane practices at a time when the Council failed to adopt a certain number of resolutions that called for an immediate ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. This failure is a shame for the Security Council, forever tarnishing it. Ladies and gentlemen, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia reiterates the demand for the Security Council to adopt a resolution in line with Chapter 7, pursuant to Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, in order to compel Israel, the occupying power, to accept a ceasefire and to guarantee the delivery of humanitarian assistance, and to end the brutal aggression against the Palestinian people, as well as to deliver the necessary protections to the Palestinian people. There's a necessary need, there's a great need to compel the occupying power to comply with the relevant Security Council resolutions, to comply with international law, to comply with international humanitarian law, as well as the 2 orders recently handed down by the International Court of Justice concerning the genocide which is currently taking place, perpetrated by Israel against the people in Palestine. To conclude, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia will continue its efforts at all levels and at all international fora to establish peace and security in the region, and this by compelling Israel, the occupying power, to accept an immediate and lasting ceasefire and to facilitate the access of humanitarian assistance without obstacles, and to end the siege imposed on the Gaza Strip, and to alleviate the suffering of the Palestinian people, and to support the efforts to establish peace in both the region and the world. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Saudi Arabia for their statement. The representative of India has asked for the floor to make further statement. I give them the floor.
Thank you, Chair, for giving me the floor. It is unfortunate that a delegation has chosen to misuse such an important forum to further their own nefarious agenda, and we only advise the delegation that the people living in glass houses should not throw stones at others, and that their energies would be better utilized in setting their own house in order. And secondly, they should reconsider wasting the time of so many delegations and bodies by misusing forums and platforms such as this one. I thank you, Chair.
I thank the representative of India for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I thank you all for your presence, and this meeting is adjourned.